Hey, welcome back, my friend. Or if tonight is your very first time here with me, then hello, and I am genuinely glad you found this little corner of the internet. Grab your blanket, get comfortable. We have a long, slow, beautiful night ahead of us, somewhere in the Swiss Alps in a valley so narrow and so deep that sunlight only touches the village floor for about 4 hours each day. A farmer's wife is already awake. It is 3:30 in the morning. No alarm, no phone, no notification asking for her attention. Just cold stone floor under her feet and a darkness so complete and so quiet that most people alive today will never in their entire lives have the chance to experience it. And here is the part that honestly stopped me cold when I first read about it. She is not miserable. She is not exhausted. She's not counting the minutes until coffee exists. According to historians who have spent decades going through the private letters, diary records and court documents of ordinary Alpine village life, people in these remote valleys were not sleeping worse than we do. In many ways, they were sleeping better. How is that possible? What did life really look like before a glowing rectangle on your nightstand told you what time it was and whether you were allowed to feel rested? Well, tonight we're going to find out. One valley at a time, one quiet hour at a time, and I promise you, by the end of this you might feel just a little bit jealous of people who lived 400 years ago, which is not something you expect to feel on a perfectly normal Tuesday night. But here we are. Now, before we go any further, if something about the pace of this, the way this is already slowing everything down just a little, is making you feel like this is exactly what you needed tonight, I would really love a like on this video and a subscribe to the channel. It costs you nothing and it genuinely means everything to me. And leave a comment down below. Tell me where in the world you're watching from right now and what time it is where you are. I read every single one. All right, lights as low as they will go, maybe a fan humming softly in the background, and let us begin. Let me paint the scene for you. We're in the Lauterbrunnen Valley in what is now Switzerland. The year is somewhere around 1680. Nobody in this village has seen an electric light or heard a train whistle, or had any particular reason to know or care what time it is in Paris right now. The valley itself is about 300 meters wide. On either side, limestone cliffs rise nearly 1,000 meters straight up, like two enormous walls built by something that had no interest in making humans feel comfortable. It is 4 o'clock in the morning. The fog has settled overnight into the bottom of the valley the way it always does, thick and white and perfectly still. From up on the cliff tops, if anyone was watching, the village would have looked like it was sleeping under a blanket of low cloud. And in a way it was. But inside the farmhouses, things were beginning to move. Here is something that historians genuinely did not understand until a researcher named Roger E. Kirsch spent more than a decade going through archived personal records across Europe. In his book At Day's Close, published in 2005, E. Kirsch documented something that changed the way scholars think about sleep night and human nature entirely. For most of human history, for centuries before the Industrial Revolution rewired everything, people did not sleep in one long, uninterrupted stretch the way we try to today. Instead, they slept in two separate phases with a natural waking period in between. They called it the first sleep and the second sleep. The first sleep would begin at dusk or shortly after. In winter, that might be 8 or 9 in the evening. Then sometime around midnight or 1 in the morning, people would simply and naturally wake up. Not because something was wrong, not because they were anxious or unwell, but because that is what the human body does when artificial light is not pushing a false stay-awake signal into the brain all evening long. And in that quiet, gentle pause between the two sleeps, that unscheduled hour in the dark middle of the night, people did something I find extraordinarily beautiful. They talked. In the farmhouses of the Alpine valleys, in the shared sleeping quarters of rural Switzerland and Austria and France, Couples would lie quietly in the dark and simply speak to one another. About the day, about a worry, about a dream they had just been having. Neighbours in the same household would murmur softly. Parents would check on children. Someone might add wood to the fire. Someone might pray. And then, as naturally as they had woken, they would drift back down into the second sleep, sit with that for a moment. Because there is something in that rhythm, that built-in pause in the middle of the night, that space for stillness that nobody scheduled and nobody could take away. That feels like something we have quietly, unknowingly lost. And I think a part of us knows it. Now, in the Lauterbrunnen Valley, as in dozens of other remote Alpine and Pyrenean valleys, I am going to walk you through tonight. The physical landscape itself reinforced this kind of slow, unhurried rhythm of life. The mountains were not simply scenery. They were architecture. They determined how long you had sunlight. They decided what crops you could grow and when. They set the outer limits of your world in a way that, rather than making life feel small, actually made it feel very full, because everything that mattered was close. In winter, the narrowest of these valleys received as few as 2 or 3 hours of direct sunlight per day. Not cloudy days, clear, cold, brilliantly blue Alpine days where the geometry of the cliffs simply refused to let the sun clear the ridge before it began its descent again. The village of Viganella in northern Italy, tucked so deep into the valley of the Antrona that it went without direct sunlight for an entire 3 months every winter, became so famous for this problem that in the year 2006 the community installed a massive steel mirror on a nearby cliff, angled to reflect a small patch of sunlight down into the village square during those dark months. Imagine what that same village looked like in the 1600s. No mirror, no electricity, no solution except simply living with the darkness. And they did. For generations. That is the detail that surprised me more than anything else when I started researching these places. These were not people sitting in misery waiting for the modern world to come and rescue them. They were not joyless villagers dreaming of central heating and streaming services. Although I will be honest, if they could have seen a heated blanket, they would have absolutely lost their minds. They had built a way of life that fit their landscape as precisely as the fog fit the valley floor. Slowly, completely, without needing to be forced. The hours before dawn in a remote European valley 4 centuries ago were not empty. They were full of the sound of cattle shifting in the stall below the living quarters, because in the traditional Alpine farmhouse the family and their animals slept in the same structure, separated by only the floor. The warmth that rose from 40 large, breathing, very opinionated animals kept the family above from freezing through the winter. Not exactly romantic, essentially like having 40 roommates who generate unlimited heat and never once offer to help with the rent, but it worked. Remarkably well, actually. The pre-dawn hours were full of the smell of last night's fire still quietly breathing in the stone hearth, full of the sound of a mountain stream running somewhere beneath the village, a sound so constant and so steady that after a while no one consciously heard it anymore. The way you stop noticing your own heartbeat until the moment it stops. And they were full of that particular darkness, the kind that exists just before the very first grey light begins to show above the cliff edge, that no description I write will ever fully capture. It was not a threatening darkness. It was not a lonely darkness. It was a darkness that was simply present, patient, the way only very old things know how to be patient. Our farmer's wife has risen. She is not rushing. There is no meeting to get to, no commute to beat. She moves through the dark rooms of her farmhouse the way any of us move through our own home at night without turning on the lights. By memory, by feel, by the kind of knowledge that lives in the body rather than the mind. She is going to start the fire, And in just a few minutes, when those first small flames catch and begin to breathe warmth back into the cold stone walls, the entire valley will begin to stir. But before we follow her to that hearth, before we step into the golden light of that kitchen and feel the morning begin, there is something you need to understand about how people in these valleys organized time itself, because they were not using clocks, not the kind hanging on a wall, not the kind ticking in a tower. The instrument that kept the rhythm of life in these places had been ringing since the 9th century, and it ran on something older than gears, older than springs, older than any mechanism invented by human hands. It ran on sound, and that sound, deep resonant rolling across a cold valley in the dark just before dawn, is exactly where our story goes next. For a moment, do nothing except listen. Not to me, just listen to whatever is around you right now. The hum of something electrical, a car passing somewhere outside, perhaps the sound of someone else in your building moving through their own evening. All of it layered, overlapping, continuous, the permanent acoustic wallpaper of modern life that we've become so accustomed to that most of us genuinely cannot remember what it feels like to be without it. Now take all of that away. Every machine, every vehicle, every screen, every system quietly running in the background of the world you live in. Take it all away and replace it with one thing only: a bell, deep, resonant, struck once cleanly in the cold pre-dawn air of an Alpine valley. The sound travels outward from the stone tower in every direction, at once reaching the cliff faces and bouncing back softer, reaching the frozen surface of the stream and crossing it without slowing, reaching the walls of the farmhouses and passing through their thick stone as a faint but unmistakable vibration. It reaches sleeping people as a physical sensation in the chest before it reaches their ears as a sound. And every single person in that valley hearing it knows exactly what it means. Not approximately, not roughly, exactly. Because for the people of the pre-industrial European mountain valleys, the church bell was not background noise, it was not ambience. It was the operating system of daily life, the one shared signal that coordinated the activities of every household in the community, that structured the hours of every waking day, that replaced entirely and completely every function that a clock performs in your life today. And it had been doing that job in various forms for a very long time. The historian and musicologist Alain Corbin spent years researching the social history of bells in rural France, and his findings, published in a remarkable study called Village Bells, documented something that I think most of us underestimate when we picture pre-modern life. The bell was not merely a timekeeping device, it was the voice of the community itself. The specific pattern of rings, not just how many times, but in what sequence, at what tempo, with what pauses between, communicated a vocabulary of information that every resident of the parish had learned from childhood, the way children today learn to read. 3 slow rings at dawn meant the beginning of the working day. A rapid succession in mid-morning meant something urgent, a fire, a flood, a threat. A slow measured single toll at irregular intervals meant that someone had died. A bright, quick celebratory pattern meant a wedding. A particular sequence on feast days was different from the sequence on ordinary Sundays, which was different from the sequence on days of special obligation, which was different again from the emergency patterns that everyone hoped they would never hear but knew immediately when they did. The bell spoke, and the village listened. Let me give you a number that I think genuinely reframes this. In the year 1800, before industrialization had fully transformed the European countryside, when most rural Alpine communities still lived largely as they had for the previous several centuries, a survey of church records in the Swiss cantons found that the average parish bell was rung in total somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 times per year. That is an average of between 5 and 8 distinct bell events per day every day year-round, from the same tower in the same valley heard by the same people. 5 to 8 times a day the bell spoke, and the village reorganized itself around what it said. Think about that in terms of what it meant for the experience of time. We mark time today with a bewildering proliferation of devices: your phone, the clock on your oven, the clock in your car, the timestamp on every email, every message, every document. Time is everywhere, unavoidable, granular to the second, and yet paradoxically most people I have spoken to about this say they feel they never have enough of it. The more precisely we measure time, the more it seems to slip through our hands. In the Alpine Valley, time was marked 5 or 6 times a day. Between these markings it was not divided, it was simply present. The hour between the morning bell and the midday bell was not cut into 60 minutes, and then 3,600 seconds. It was just the morning. It was the length of time it took to do what needed doing in the morning, and when the bell rang again, the morning was over. I have been thinking about whether this made people more or less anxious about time than we are, and the more I sit with it, the more I think the answer is less, significantly less. Not because their lives were easier, they were not in almost any physical sense, but because the granularity was lower. You cannot be late by 7 minutes in a world that does not measure minutes. The bell towers themselves are among the oldest surviving structures in many European mountain communities. In the Italian Prealps and the South Tyrolean Dolomites, detached bell towers, campaniles built separate from the church building sometimes by several meters, date to the 9th and 10th centuries. The separation was partly practical. A freestanding tower was less likely to bring the church down with it if it fell, and its greater height without the constraint of the church roof meant the bell could be heard from further away. In the canton of Ticino in southern Switzerland, where the valleys run north-south, between the main Alpine ridge and the Lombard plain, there are campaniles documented in parish records going back to the 11th century that are still standing today. Not as museum pieces, as active bell towers ringing on the same schedule they have rung on for 1,000 years. The continuity is not symbolic. It is simply that nobody ever had a good reason to stop. The bells themselves were objects of extraordinary care and considerable expense. Casting a large church bell, the process of preparing the mould, smelting the bronze alloy of copper and tin to the precise ratio that produced the desired tone, pouring the molten metal, and allowing it to cool over several days, then the careful breaking of the mould and the anxious first strike that revealed whether the tone was what the community had paid for was one of the most skilled and most expensive craft operations in medieval and early modern Europe. A large bell could weigh between 500 and several thousand kilograms. The cost was typically borne by the entire community together, donations collected over years, sometimes supplemented by the sale of communal land or assets, sometimes supported by a particularly generous benefactor, whose name was then cast into the bell's surface as a form of permanent acknowledgement. The bell was community property in the most literal sense. The whole valley had paid for it. The whole valley heard it. The whole valley organized its life around it. And when a bell cracked, which happened occasionally from the stress of constant use, from the expansion and contraction of temperature changes, from the sheer accumulated fatigue of metal struck thousands of times a year for decades, the loss was felt as something close to communal grief. There are parish records from multiple Alpine communities describing the cracking of a bell in terms that carry genuine emotional weight. Not just inconvenience. Grief. The voice of the community had gone silent, and until the bell was recast, which required the entire expensive process to be undertaken again, the village felt its absence in every unmarked hour of every day. One Swiss parish record from the early 17th century from a community in the canton of Glarus describes the period between a cracked bell and its replacement as lasting 18 months. 18 months of using a smaller, lesser bell as a temporary substitute, its thinner tone carrying less far and ringing with less authority. The record notes with evident relief the day the new bell was installed and first rung. The language used is the language of restoration. Something essential had been returned. Now here is a detail about Alpine bell towers that I find genuinely delightful, and that I suspect most people have never thought about. The bell ringer was a professional, not in the sense of someone with a formal degree, but in the sense of someone who held a specific role, received specific compensation, usually a combination of small monetary payment and certain use rights to church property, and was personally responsible for maintaining the accuracy and reliability of the bell schedule. This person knew as part of their professional competence how to judge the time without a mechanical clock. They read the sky, the position of the sun in summer, the particular quality of the light at different hours, the angle of the shadows cast by the tower itself, which functioned as a sundial for anyone who knew how to read it. In winter, when overcast skies could obscure the sun for days at a time, experienced bell ringers developed a remarkable internal sense of time, the kind of time awareness that people who work outdoors in demanding conditions still report today. A sensitivity to the rhythm of the day that is not measured by any instrument, but is nonetheless accurate for that. There are accounts of experienced Alpine bell ringers in the 18th century who asked to estimate the time of day without any external reference could place it within 15 to 20 minutes with routine reliability. Not because they were exceptional, because they had been paying attention to the same thing every day for 20 or 30 years. Does that kind of attention, that patient, repeated, sustained noticing of the same rhythm over a long span of time sound like something that has mostly disappeared from modern life? I think it might. The kind of knowledge that only comes from doing the same thing in the same place with the same quality of presence over years and years and years. We have optimized our world for novelty and for efficiency, and in doing so we have made that kind of long, quiet, accumulating knowledge much harder to come by. The bell ringer in the Lauterbrunnen Valley or the Engadin or the Alster Valley knew things about time that cannot be put in a manual. He knew how the light changed across the specific topography of his specific valley at every hour of every season of every year. He knew which shadow on which wall at which angle meant it was time for the midday bell. He knew the smell of the air at the hour before dawn. The knowledge was in his body, not in a text, and it died with him, as this kind of knowledge always does unless there was someone paying the same quality of attention alongside him as he learned it. The last full-time professional bell ringers in the traditional Alpine sense, those who kept the complete bell schedule without mechanical assistance, had largely disappeared by the early 20th century, replaced by clockwork mechanisms that automated the striking. The knowledge is not entirely gone. In some communities, particularly in the more traditional Catholic valleys of the Austrian Tyrol and the Swiss cantons, bell ringing as a practice skill is maintained by volunteer associations who ring by hand for feast days and special occasions. But the daily functional time-organizing use of the bell as the primary clock of community life is gone. It ended quietly and without much ceremony sometime in the century between 1850 and 1950, as mechanical timekeeping penetrated even the most remote valleys, and the bell went from being the voice of the community's time to being an ornament of its tradition. I do not think that is entirely a loss. I am not a person who believes that every old thing was better than every new thing, and I would not give up my ability to know the exact time at any moment, which has saved me from missing more trains than I care to count. But I do think there is something worth noticing in the shift. The bell gathered everyone toward the same moment. The mechanical clock and then the digital clock gave each person their own private time, their own relationship with the seconds, their own scheduling, their own granular relationship with the hours. We gained independence from each other's time. and in gaining that independence we lost something of the shared rhythm that the bell created, the sense that it is the same time right now for all of us in this valley, that we are all in this hour together. The bell has rung the first hour of morning in our valley. The farmhouses are stirring, the fires are being lit. The day is beginning to take its shape, the slow, purposeful, physically present shape of a day, in a place where almost everything that happens outdoors, with the body in direct contact with the land and the animals and the season. And somewhere up the slope above the village, above the last farm and the first trees of the pine forest, and the long zigzag summer path that eventually reaches the high pastures, something else is stirring too. Something that happens only twice a year, but when it happens fills this same valley with a sound so layered, so physical, so joyful, that it bounces off these very same limestone walls and arrives at these very same farmhouse doors like music composed by the mountain itself. The bells are coming, but not the bells of the tower. These bells are moving, they are coming down the mountain, and they are telling the village something that no church bell has ever been asked to say. There is a sound that every child in the Alpine valleys of Tyrol knew by heart long before they could read a single word. Not the church bell, not the rushing stream, not even the wind moving through the pine forests above the village. It was the sound of 100 cowbells ringing all at once, a low-layered rolling cascade of iron and brass that bounced off the cliff walls and filled the entire valley from one stone face to the other, a sound so full, so physical you could almost feel it in the ribs. And when that sound came rolling down the mountain path in the pale golden light of a September morning, every single person in the village stopped whatever they were doing, put down whatever was in their hands, and walked outside. Because that sound meant only one thing. The herds were coming home. I want to take a moment and just ask you something genuinely. Have you ever been part of something that happened exactly the same way every single year for as long as anyone could remember? A family tradition, maybe. A holiday ritual. Something so fixed, so reliable that the repetition itself became the point. There is something deeply comforting about that kind of rhythm. Something that makes you feel connected to something larger than yourself, even if you cannot quite explain why. Now imagine that tradition is not 50 years old, not 100 years old, but closer to 3,000 years old. And it is not just your family doing it, it is your entire valley. The valley above you, the valley 3 mountains over. Every shepherd, every farmer, every child old enough to walk carrying a stick, all of them moving together up and then back down the mountain in a rhythm so ancient it predates every kingdom, every church, every border that ever tried to divide those peaks. That practice has a name, and it is one of the most quietly extraordinary things in all of European history. It is called transhumance. The word itself comes from the old Latin roots, trans, meaning across, and humus, meaning earth or ground. Moving across the ground, simple, almost plain as a description, but what it actually means in practice is this: twice a year, every year without exception, the people of the mountain valleys picked up their entire agricultural life and migrated with their animals along routes that had been worn into the mountain terrain over thousands of years of use. In spring, usually sometime in late May or early June, depending on when the snow finally left the high pastures, the cattle went up, and in autumn, late August, September, sometimes early October if the weather held, they came back down, up in the spring, down in the fall, every year, without fail, for generations beyond counting. In December of the year 2019, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization added transhumance to its representative list of intangible cultural heritage of humanity. It was a formal recognition shared between Austria, Greece, Italy, Luxembourg, Romania, Spain, Croatia, France and Slovakia. 9 countries, 1 practice, Because transhumance does not belong to a single nation. It belongs to the mountains themselves. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me bring you back to the valley. Because the numbers and the official recognitions are all well and good, but they do not tell you what it actually felt like. The spring ascent, called the Alpafzug in the German-speaking regions or the Alpfahrt in certain parts of Switzerland, was not a quiet, business-like movement of livestock from one pasture to another. It was an event. It was a social occasion. It was in many ways the most important day in the village calendar outside of a major religious feast. Preparations began days in advance. The animals were checked their hooves, inspected their condition, assessed after the long winter indoors. The leather harnesses and the great iron bells were cleaned and polished. The paths were scouted to make sure the winter had not taken a section of rock and dropped it across the route. And then there was the question of who would go up. In the valleys of Tyrol, in the Salzkammergut region of Austria, in the high meadows above the Swiss canton of Appenzell, the practice for centuries was to send the young people, often teenagers. Boys and girls in their early adolescence or late teens would spend the entire summer season up on the high pastures, the Alm as they were called in the Austrian and Bavarian tradition, or the Alpage in French, living in small stone huts, managing the herd largely on their own, and making cheese from the milk they collected each day. Think about that for a second. A 14-year-old alone on a mountain meadow somewhere above 2,000 meters, responsible for 40 or 60 animals, miles of rocky terrain between them and the nearest adult, with nothing but a small stone shelter and several months of solitude ahead of them. No phone signal up there. No road. No way to quickly call for help if a calf got into trouble, if a storm came in fast and hard from the west, if someone twisted an ankle on the loose rock above the tree line. The young sennerin, the Alpine dairymaid, or the senner her male counterpart was expected to handle it. And here is what fascinates me about this. Historians who have studied the diaries and letters of former Alpine herdsmen and women, particularly from the 19th century when literacy had spread far enough into rural Alpine communities that ordinary people were regularly writing things down, consistently find the same thing. The summer on the Alm was not remembered as a hardship. It was remembered as freedom, the silence, the clean air that had never been breathed by anyone else, the complete uninterrupted ownership of your own time, the way the stars over an alpine meadow look when there is no village light below you, no torch, no fire near enough to wash them out. Many of these accounts describe the mountain summer as the most vivid, most alive period of the year. Some describe feeling for the first time in their lives that the world was genuinely enormous and that they belonged in it. There is something in that experience, I think, that a lot of us would recognize. That particular quality of solitude that is not loneliness. That sense of competence that only comes when you're genuinely entirely responsible for yourself. Now. The autumn descent was something different altogether. Coming down was a celebration in a way that going up never quite was. Because going up was work, necessary, important, full of purpose, but fundamentally a practical undertaking. Coming down was a homecoming. The Almabtrieb, the autumn cattle drive, became over the centuries one of the most visually spectacular folk events in the entire Alpine world. And it is still practiced today in many Austrian and Bavarian communities, drawing visitors from across Europe and well beyond. Here is how it worked, and how in many places it still works. The lead cow, the animal that had walked at the front of the herd all summer, that had been calm and steady and reliable in the high pastures, was decorated. I do not mean a ribbon tied around her neck. I mean full, elaborate, hand-crafted floral headdresses, enormous constructions of pine branches, wildflowers, carved wooden figures and ribbons, sometimes incorporating small mirrors, mounted between the horns. The bigger and more elaborate the decoration, the better the summer the herd had experienced. A fully decorated lead cow was a message to the entire valley. We had a good season. No animals were lost. The cheese is ready. Everything is well. If animals had died during the summer, to illness, to falls, to predators, the lead cow came down without decoration. Just plain leather and a bell. The village read that too without a word being spoken. It is hard to imagine a more elegant form of communication, honestly. The entire agricultural report of a summer season, delivered silently visually in the first 10 seconds of seeing the herd come around the mountain bend. The procession itself wound down through the village in a specific traditional order. The decorated lead cow first, then the rest of the herd, then the herdsmen and women in their regional dress, then the families who had come out to walk alongside. The bells created that layered resonant music I described at the beginning. Different sizes of bells hung at different heights around different animals, producing different pitches that together made something closer to a chord than a single note. There were people in these villages documented in local records as far back as the early 16th century, who were considered specialists in bell tuning, who could select and arrange the bells on a herd so that the combined sound struck a particular harmony when the animals moved together. Think about that level of attention, that level of care given to something as seemingly incidental as the sound your cows make walking home. That is not carelessness. That is not the life of people too poor and too isolated to notice beauty. That is a culture that had decided, consciously or not, that beauty was worth tending even in the most functional corners of daily life. And that for me is where transhumance stops being just a farming practice and starts being something closer to a philosophy. The villages that sent their animals up in spring and welcomed them back in autumn were not simply managing a resource. They were participating in a ritual that organized their entire year around movement, return, and renewal. The mountain was not something to be conquered or cleared or built over. It was a partner, a seasonal partner with its own demands and its own gifts. And the deal was straightforward. You respect the mountain's rhythm and the mountain gives you everything you need to survive. Across the Pyrenees in southwestern France, the transhumance routes, called Driel in that region, ran for hundreds of kilometers through limestone upland and oak forest. Some of these paths are so ancient that traces of their use have been found in early Bronze Age archaeological surveys, meaning human beings and their animals have been walking the same routes for more than 3,000 years. They follow contour lines with an almost architectural precision, avoiding the steepest ground-crossing streams at the shallowest fords, finding the exact same gaps in the ridgeline that shepherds identified before the first Roman soldier ever set foot in Gaul. 3,000 years of the same footsteps in the same direction for the same reason. If that does not make you feel the weight of time in your chest, I genuinely do not know what will. The bells of the herd fading down the valley path are quiet now. The animals are back in the barn below the farmhouse. The young senner, who spent 4 months on the mountain, has washed the trail off his boots and sat down at the family table for the first time since June. The lead cow's floral headdress hangs on the barn wall. It will stay there through the winter, a kind of record, a kind of trophy, a kind of thank you to an animal that did its job well. And the farmhouse itself, that stone and timber structure that has sheltered this family through every one of these seasonal cycles for longer than their own memory can reach, settles into the rhythm of its autumn night. The fire is low, the voices are soft, but the farmhouse is not just a shelter. It was never simply a shelter. It was an engineering solution to one of the most brutal problems in European mountain life. How do you keep a family of 7 or 8 people alive through 6 months of Alpine winter when the temperature drops so far below freezing that your water bucket turns solid overnight? The answer that Alpine builders arrived at over centuries is one of the most quietly ingenious things I've ever come across, and it lives entirely in the architecture of the rooms themselves. That is exactly what we're going to step into next. Pull your blanket a little closer, because we are about to step inside. Not into just any building, but into one of the most cleverly engineered living spaces ever built by ordinary people who had no architect, no blueprint, no engineering degree, and no choice but to get it exactly right. Because in the Alps, if your home failed you in February, there was no calling for help. There was no backup plan. The mountain did not give second chances. The traditional Alpine farmhouse, the Bauernhaus as it is called across the German-speaking regions of Switzerland, Austria and Bavaria, looks from the outside almost comically oversized. The roof is enormous, dramatically, almost absurdly enormous. It sweeps down so low on either side that in some examples the eave line comes within 1.5 meters of the ground. Walking toward one of these buildings for the first time, you get the strange impression that the house is mostly roof, with just a modest suggestion of wall underneath, like a very large hat sitting on a very small head. That roof is not an accident. It is not a stylistic choice. It is the answer to a problem that kills people: snow load. In the Central Alps, a single winter can deposit more than 3 meters of accumulated snowfall on a structure. At the density of wet alpine snow, that weight can reach several hundred kilograms per square meter. A steep roof, and Alpine roofs are almost always steeply pitched, typically between 40 and 60 degrees of incline, sheds that snow before it can accumulate to dangerous levels. A flatter roof holds it. And a roof that holds too much snow eventually becomes a roof that is no longer there. The farmers who built these houses did not know the physics. They did not need to. What they knew was what they had seen, what had stood, and what had collapsed. Over several hundred years of watching the steep roof became the only acceptable answer, and the knowledge passed from father to son and mother to daughter, the way all critical survival information travels in a pre-literate community, not through textbooks, but through the body, through habit, through the quiet authority of people who'd been doing this for longer than anyone could remember. But here is the detail that stopped me in my tracks the first time I really thought about it. Under that enormous roof, the traditional Bauernhaus did not separate its functions the way we would expect. There was no separate barn, no separate granary, no separate dairy, each in its own distinct structure, the way a modern farm might arrange things. Everything, the family's living quarters, the animal stalls, the hay storage, the grain, the tools, was housed under a single continuous roof. One building, one structure, everything together. Now your first reaction might be the same as mine. That sounds chaotic. It sounds like it smells terrible, and I will not pretend that it did not, because it almost certainly did, at least by any standard we would apply today. But the logic is so elegant once you understand the thermal engineering behind it, that you almost want to applaud whoever first figured it out. The animals generated heat. Enormous amounts of heat. A single adult cow produces roughly the equivalent of a 1.5 kilowatt space heater, continuously, simply by being alive and breathing. 40 cows in a ground floor stall directly beneath the family's sleeping quarters produced enough radiant warmth rising through the wooden floor above them to make the difference between a survivable winter and one that was not. The animals were not just food, they were the heating system. And the heating system had a name and a heart, and it sat in the very centre of the farmhouse like something almost sacred. It was called the Kachelofen. The Kachelofen, sometimes translated as the tile stove or the masonry heater, is one of the great unsung engineering achievements of European history, and I say that with complete sincerity. We talk endlessly about cathedrals and castles and aqueducts, and they deserve all the admiration they get, but the Kachelofen quietly kept millions of ordinary people alive through centuries of brutal winters, and almost nobody outside of Central Europe gives it a second thought. Here is how it works and why it is so remarkable. A conventional fireplace, the kind you might picture in an English manor house or in a colonial American home, burns wood and sends the heat directly up the chimney. Fast, dramatic, visually satisfying, also profoundly inefficient. The vast majority of the thermal energy produced by the burning wood exits the building immediately through the flue. Historians and building scientists who have analysed historical open fireplaces estimate that they may retain as little as 10 to 15% of the heat generated by the wood they consume. The rest goes straight up and out into the sky. You're essentially heating the outside. The Catchalofen works on a completely different principle. The firebox, the actual combustion chamber where the wood burns, is connected to a long winding internal flue system built entirely of dense clay brick and ceramic tiles. The hot gases from the fire do not go straight up. They travel through this maze of internal channels, transferring their heat into the surrounding masonry at every turn before finally exiting through a narrow chimney at a temperature already dramatically lower than when they left the firebox. The masonry itself, tons of it, absorbs that heat and then releases it slowly, steadily over the following 12 to 24 hours. You light the Catchalofen once in the morning. It burns hot and fast for 2 or 3 hours, and then the fire goes out, completely out, and the stove continues to gently warm the room for the rest of the day and through the night, releasing heat at a slow, even deeply comfortable rate. One firing, 1 day of warmth, sometimes more. The earliest documented Catchalofens in Central Europe date to the 13th century, with the form becoming widespread across Alpine regions from the 14th century onward. By the 16th century, craftsmen who specialized in building and decorating these stoves, the Hafner as they were called, had become some of the most sought-after artisans in any Alpine community. The tiles that covered the exterior surface of the stove evolved from plain functional glazed ceramic into elaborate pictorial programs, biblical scenes, hunting scenes, portraits of saints, pastoral landscapes rendered in green and blue and deep ochre, each tile individually made and fired in a small workshop and fitted together into a continuous visual narrative that covered the most important piece of furniture in the house. I want you to picture that for a moment. A farmer and his family living in a narrow Alpine valley far from any city, spending their evenings in a room warmed by a stove covered in hand-painted ceramic art. Not bare walls and miserable cold, but genuine, considered, intentional beauty built directly into the architecture of their most essential object. There is a particular Catchalofen in the Swiss National Museum in Zurich dated to approximately the year 1500 that stands nearly 2 meters tall and is covered in more than 200 individual decorated tiles. Each one is different. Each one was made by a craftsman who cared enough about the work to make it beautiful, even knowing it would spend its entire life in a farmhouse that most people in that era would have considered unremarkable. That is not poverty. That is a completely different set of priorities about what matters. Now, let me ask you something honestly. When you picture a medieval or early modern European farmhouse, what smell comes to mind? I suspect for most people it is something vaguely unpleasant. Mud, perhaps? Animals? Smoke? And the smoke would be correct, because the kitchen in the traditional Alpine farmhouse was often what the German-speaking world called a Rauchküche, literally a smoke kitchen. A kitchen with no chimney. The fire burned in an open hearth in the centre of the room, and the smoke rose and distributed itself through the upper air of the room, before slowly finding its way out through small openings under the eaves of the roof. This sounds primitive, and by modern standards it absolutely is. But the Rauchküche served purposes beyond simply cooking the food. The smoke preserved the timber, Wooden beams and roof structures that were continuously exposed to smoke from below were effectively being treated against rot, fungal growth and insect damage. The same chemical process used in smokehouse preservation of meat applied passively and continuously to the entire structural skeleton of the building. Historians of vernacular architecture have noted that some Alpine farmhouses built in the 15th and 16th centuries, whose kitchens remained as smoke kitchens until the 19th century, have structural timbers in almost astonishing condition compared to buildings of similar age that adopted chimney systems earlier. The smoke was also where the food lived, hanging from the rafters above the hearth. In the upper air where the smoke drifted and thickened before escaping, were the hams, the sausages, the dried fish, the strings of mushrooms, the bundles of herbs that had been gathered in summer and were now slowly being preserved by the same smoke that was treating the wood above them. The kitchen ceiling was a pantry, and the pantry worked by the same fire that cooked the morning porridge. Every single thing in this farmhouse earned its place twice. And then there was the bread. Oh, the bread. I realize I'm about to spend several minutes talking about bread with what might seem like disproportionate enthusiasm, but I'm going to ask you to trust me on this one. Because bread in the Alpine farmhouse was not simply food. It was a calendar event. It was a social act. And the way it was made and when and how it was shared tells you something essential about the texture of daily life in these valleys that no amount of historical data can quite capture on its own. In most remote Alpine and pre-Alpine communities, from the medieval period through well into the 19th century, bread was not baked every day. Baking was too demanding in terms of fuel, too time-consuming and too dependent on a large wood-fired stone oven that needed hours of preparation to be brought to the right temperature. Instead, bread was baked in large batches once a week at best, and in some particularly remote communities, particularly through the long winter months, once every 2 or 3 weeks. Many villages shared a communal baking oven, the Dorfbackofen, the village bread oven, a massive stone construction sometimes freestanding in a small stone building of its own, near the centre of the village, sometimes built into the wall of the largest farmhouse. The schedule for its use rotated through the households of the village, each family taking their turn on the appointed day to bring their dough fire the oven and claim their share of the baking for the weeks ahead. The management of that schedule, who went when what happened when someone's turn fell on a feast day, how disputes were resolved when 2 families both needed the oven urgently, was, according to records kept in various Swiss and Austrian parish archives from the 16th century onward, a genuinely significant source of community negotiation and occasionally community conflict. One set of village records from the canton of Bern from the mid-17th century includes an extended dispute between 2 neighbouring families over a missed oven turn during a particularly cold January. The parish priest was called in to mediate over bread, which honestly makes complete sense. If your bread supply runs out 3 weeks into a month-long snowstorm and you cannot bake more because someone else has the oven locked and will not negotiate, the stakes are not small. This is not a disagreement about inconvenience. This is a disagreement about food. The bread itself was built for longevity in a way that would be almost unrecognizable to anyone who has grown up with soft, pillowy supermarket loaves that go stale in 3 days. Alpine farmhouse bread was dense, coarse-grained rye and spelt flour shaped into large round loaves called Lebe, baked hard and dry. In the Engadin region of Switzerland and in parts of Tyrol, a specific form of extremely hard flat bread, baked until almost all moisture was driven out, was stored for months without spoiling, softened when needed by soaking briefly in warm water or crumbling into soup. In the Vinschgau Valley in what is now South Tyrol, a version of this hard flatbread called Vinschger Paal has been made continuously according to local historical accounts for at least 700 years. It is still baked today. The same dark rye flour, the same caraway and fennel seeds, the same flat oval shape, the same stone oven process. 700 years, the same bread. There is a researcher, a food historian named Elizabeth Lucchesi, who's written about the way these Alpine bread traditions functioned not just as food preservation strategies, but as a form of collective memory. The recipe itself carried in the hands of women who learned by watching their mothers rather than by following any written instruction, was a kind of knowledge that belonged to the community rather than to any individual. When a family moved away from the valley, they carried the bread with them. When they arrived somewhere new, the bread they brought identified them, their origin, their season, the particular combination of grains that grew in their specific altitude of valley. Your bread told people where you were from, before you said a single word. I find that beautiful in a way I cannot fully articulate. The idea that something as fundamental as daily, as seemingly ordinary as bread could carry that kind of encoded information. That the food you ate was in some sense a portrait of the landscape that made you. The stone oven has gone cold now. The bread from last week's baking is wrapped in cloth in the cool back room. The catchalofen is still breathing its slow warmth into the air of the stuba, and the family has settled into the evening hours the way water settles into a still pool, gradually, completely without resistance. But there is still one more sound threading through this farmhouse tonight. A sound coming from just outside the walls, constant, rhythmic, patient. The sound that has been running underneath everything we've talked about since the very beginning. So familiar to the people of this valley that most of them no longer consciously hear it at all. The stream, the mill, the water, and what that water made possible, the kind of mechanical power that shaped every single valley we're travelling through tonight, is a story that goes back to the Romans and forward into a future that no Alpine farmer of the 17th century could have imagined. That is exactly where we are headed next. Close your eyes for just a moment and listen, not to me, to the sound I want you to imagine, a stream. Mountain water cold enough to make your teeth ache running fast and clear over round grey stones at the edge of a valley. Not a roaring torrent, just a steady, purposeful rush of water that knows exactly where it is going, and has been going there without interruption for longer than any human alive can remember. The sound is somewhere between a hiss and a murmur, constant, unchanging, the kind of sound that fills in the silence so completely that after a while silence and the sound of water become the same thing. Now add one more sound on top of it, a low, deep, rhythmic thudding, wooden on wooden, slow enough to feel deliberate, a sound that repeats every 2 or 3 seconds perfectly, even never rushing, never pausing. Day and night, summer and winter through rain, and through the first thin ice of October, forming at the stream's edges. That is the sound of a watermill, and for most of the remote European valleys we're travelling through tonight, that sound was as fundamental to daily life as breathing. Not background noise, active presence. The mill was not simply a building by the water, it was the engine of the valley, the one piece of technology that stood between a community and the raw, unprocessed weight of everything the land produced. Let me put some real numbers around this, because I think they are genuinely astonishing. When William I of England commissioned the great survey of his kingdom, that we now call the Domesday Book, completed in the year 1086, his surveyors counted 5,624 watermills operating in England south of the River Trent alone. 5,624, for a total population that historians estimate at somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million people at the time. That is approximately 1 watermill for every 350 people, and England was not exceptional. A survey of French records from the 11th century suggests there were as many as 20,000 watermills operating across what is now France. The historian Marc Bloch, one of the great French historians of the 20th century whose work on medieval rural life remains essential reading, describe the spread of the watermill across early medieval Europe as a genuine technological revolution happening quietly, incrementally, village by village, valley by valley over several centuries. Not dramatic, not announced by anyone. Just slowly the water started doing work that human muscles has been doing before. But to understand what the mill actually meant in a remote Alpine valley, you need to go back even further. Because the Romans got there first. About 20 kilometres northeast of the city of Arles in the south of what is now France, there is a site called Barbegal. And at Barbegal in the 2nd century of the Common Era, Roman engineers built something that has no real parallel anywhere else in the ancient world. They built 16 water wheels, arranged in 2 parallel channels descending a hillside in a staircase formation, each wheel feeding into the next. The Barbegal mill complex was powered by an aqueduct that the same engineers had already built to supply water to the city of Arles. The wheels drove millstones, and those millstones running continuously could produce somewhere in the range of 4.5 tons of flour per day, enough historians calculate to supply the bread requirements of approximately 12,500 people. 12,500 people. Fed by water and stone and Roman engineering in the 2nd century. And then the Roman Empire contracted. The infrastructure it had built, the aqueducts, the roads, the great mill complexes, was not maintained at the same scale. But the knowledge of what water could do did not disappear. It simplified. It localized. It moved from the grand civic scale of a Roman industrial complex down to the human scale of a single wheel, turning in a single stream at the edge of a single village. And in that smaller, more intimate form it spread everywhere. Into the Alpine valleys, into the narrow gorges of the Pyrenees, into the forested river systems of the Black Forest, and the Carpathians, and the highlands of Scotland. Wherever water ran fast enough, and a community needed grain ground, cloth processed, or wood cut, the wheel appeared. Now here is something I find genuinely fascinating about the social history of these valley mills, and it is something that tends to get lost when we talk about mills purely as technology. The miller was not a simple labourer. In almost every European rural community from the medieval period through the 19th century, the miller occupied a social position that was simultaneously powerful, useful, necessary, and, this is the interesting part, deeply mistrusted. Think about why. Everyone in the valley needed the miller. You could not eat your grain until it had been ground. You had no choice about going to the mill, and in most communities you had no choice about which mill you went to. The lord or the monastery or the community that owned the mill had the legal right of what was called multure, the obligatory use of their mill, and the miller collected payment in kind. Typically between 1/16 and 1/8 of the grain you brought to be ground was kept by the miller as his fee. In a community where grain was survival, having someone with their hands on that proportion of the food supply, someone who could at least in theory take more than his share and claim the measurement was simply what the work required, put the miller in a position of power that everyone around him recognized and nobody was entirely comfortable with. The miller was wealthy by valley standards. The mill itself was one of the most valuable pieces of infrastructure in any community. The miller's house was typically larger than the farmhouses around it. His animals were better fed. His children married well. And yet in the folklore and the popular literature of rural Europe across centuries and across languages, French, German, Italian, English, Scandinavian, the miller appears again and again as a figure of ambiguity. Clever, yes. Prosperous, yes, but also suspected of subtle dishonesty of using a weighted scale of skimming just a little more flour than the arrangement allowed. There is a line in a German proverb documented as early as the 15th century that translates roughly as an honest miller has a golden thumb, meaning the thumb that felt the grain to judge its quality was the thumb that also controlled how much went into the miller's own sack. The golden thumb was the thumb nobody trusted but everybody needed. I love this detail, because it tells you something true about how small communities actually function. Not in perfect harmony, not in the idealized pastoral peace that city people tend to project onto rural life, but in a web of mutual dependency and mutual watchfulness. The valley needed the miller needed the valley, and they watched each other closely with a combination of respect and wariness that kept everything in a kind of practical balance. But grain was only the beginning of what a watermill could do. At some point, historians place the earliest documented examples in Europe at around the 10th century, though some argue for earlier. Someone had the insight that the same rotating shaft that drove a millstone could drive other things as well. A hammer, a bellows, a frame of paddles for beating and compressing wet wool cloth into felt. The mechanism was the same, only the tool at the end of it changed. The fulling mill, which used water-powered wooden hammers to beat newly woven wool cloth, compressing and thickening the fibres into the dense weatherproof material that Alpine mountain people needed for their outer garments, became as essential to valley communities as the grain mill. In the valleys of the Tyrolean and Vorarlberg regions of Western Austria, documentary records from the 14th and 15th centuries show clusters of specialized mills along single watercourses, a grain mill here, a fulling mill just downstream, a sawmill further down where the gradient steepened, and sometimes a hammer mill for working iron at the point where the water ran fastest. A single stream organized from top to bottom as an industrial system, each wheel taking a portion of the water's energy, passing the rest downstream to the next wheel, with the whole sequence planned across decades of community investment and local knowledge about exactly how much water the stream carried in each season and at what gradient it could turn a wheel of what size. This is not primitive. This is sophisticated. This is a community that understood its landscape with a precision that we who mostly experience rivers as something to kayak on or look at from a bridge have genuinely lost. And here is the other thing the mill was beyond its function. It was the village news exchange. You went to the mill when you needed to, and waiting your turn at the mill, which could take hours depending on the queue, you sat with your neighbours, you talked, you heard what was happening in the village at the far end of the valley. You learned that someone had been ill, that a roof had been damaged in the last storm that a traveller had passed through 3 days ago with news from the city. The mill was one of the very few places where men and women from different households in a remote valley were guaranteed to be in the same place at the same time, without a religious occasion requiring it. The mill was a waiting room, and like all waiting rooms across all of human history, it was where people talked. Think about that next time you're sitting somewhere waiting, slightly impatient, wishing things would move faster. You're doing something humans have always done. The location changes. The impatience is eternal. The wheel is still turning now at the edge of our imaginary valley. The stream is still running. The sound, that slow, patient, rhythmic thud, continues through the afternoon and into the evening because the water does not take breaks. But there is something happening just a few hundred meters up the slope above the mill that has even more to say about the particular genius of these valleys, something that came directly from the isolation we've been describing all evening, the isolation that kept these communities cut off from the outside world for months at a time, that forced them to preserve everything they produced, that made waste a form of failure the community simply could not afford. And what came from that isolation, from that particular combination of cold air and patient hands and centuries of quiet refinement, became something that the entire world now puts on a wooden board at dinner parties and considers a luxury. We are heading into the cave. The cave does not look like much from the outside. A low wooden door, iron-hinged, set into the side of a limestone hillside just above the village. The kind of door you would walk past without a second glance if you did not know what was behind it. No sign, no decoration, just old wood, dark with age and damp and a faint smell drifting from the gap at the threshold that is difficult to describe to someone who has never encountered it before. It is somewhere between earth and salt and something living, a smell that is distinctly, unmistakably alive. You push the door open. Cold air moves past you out into the afternoon warmth, and you step in. The ceiling is low. The walls are rough limestone beaded with condensation. The floor is packed earth slightly uneven, cool under your boots, and on either side of a narrow central passage on wooden shelves that run from floor to ceiling in both directions are wheels of cheese, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds in a large cave, each one roughly the size of a wagon wheel, pale gold to deep amber on the rind, stacked 2 or 3 high. On the shelves, their surfaces marked with the faint brush strokes of the salt water and the special brine solution that has been applied to them by hand regularly for months. The air in here is somewhere between 8 and 14 degrees, not freezing, specifically deliberately not freezing, and the humidity is close to 95%. These are not accidental conditions. They are the result of centuries of observation of understanding exactly what this particular combination of temperature and moisture does to the chemistry of aging milk, and of choosing cave locations that naturally produce those conditions with the minimum of intervention. The people who built these shelves and stocked them with these wheels did not have thermometers. They did not have hygrometers. They had their hands, their noses, their accumulated knowledge, and the fact that every wheel they got wrong was a wheel that could not be eaten, and a winter that was just a little more uncertain. That is a powerful teacher. Now let me give you some context that genuinely reframed the way I think about Swiss and Alpine cheese, because I suspect most people, if asked where Gruyere or Emmental comes from, would say something like Switzerland, obviously, and perhaps picture rolling green hills and happy cows and leave it at that, which is accurate as far as it goes. But it misses the point entirely. These cheeses did not come from abundance. They came from a problem. Here is the problem. You're a dairy farmer in the Gruyere district of the canton of Fribourg in Switzerland, somewhere in the 12th or 13th century. Your cows spend the summer on the high Alpine pastures. We talked about that, the transhumance, the summer season on the Alm. And during that summer, those cows produce far more milk than you and your family and your immediate neighbours can possibly consume fresh. Milk does not keep, not in any climate, and certainly not in the fluctuating temperatures of an Alpine summer, where a warm afternoon can turn cold overnight and back again. You cannot store it. You cannot transport it in any useful quantity down the mountain to a market because the mountain path takes 2 days on foot, and the milk would be ruined long before it arrived anywhere. So you have a surplus of the most perishable thing imaginable, and you are miles from anywhere. What do? You transform it. You use the bacterial cultures naturally present in raw mountain milk, cultures that have been living in that milk in those particular meadows, eating those particular wildflowers and alpine grasses for generations, to begin the fermentation process. You add rennet, the natural enzyme derived from the stomach lining of a young calf, which causes the milk proteins to coagulate into solid curds. You press those curds into a mould under enormous weight to expel the liquid whey, and then you salt the outside and you put it somewhere cool and you wait. What comes out the other end is not perishable. What comes out the other end, if you have done it correctly, will last for months. Will last in the case of a well-made hard Alpine cheese, aged under the right conditions for a year or more, and will crucially taste better at the end of that year than it did at the beginning. You have taken the most fragile, most temporary product of your summer pasture and turned it into the most durable thing in your winter larder. That is not just cooking. That is a fundamental act of transformation. It is alchemy in the oldest and most literal sense, taking one substance and making it into something categorically different with different properties, different possibilities, a different relationship to time. The first documented mention of Gruyere cheese specifically, named for the medieval town of Gruyere, which sits in a valley in the foothills of the Fribourg Alps, appears in records from the year 1115, more than 900 years ago. The cheese was being traded taxed and used as a form of payment in local transactions. The abbots of the region were collecting it as a form of rent from dairy farmers on their lands. It was already in the 12th century recognized as a commodity of real value. But here is the detail that catches me every time. The reason Gruyere tastes the way it does, that particular nutty, slightly sweet, deeply complex flavor that develops over months of aging, is directly irreversibly connected to the specific grass and wildflowers that grow in the Alpine meadows of the Gruyere and Fribourg regions. The cows that produce the milk eat plants that grow at altitude in thin, mineral-rich soil in an environment that is compressed in time. The growing season is short, the flowers are intense. The nutritional density of the herbage is different from what you find at lower elevations. That diet is expressed in the milk. The milk's particular bacterial composition is expressed in the cheese, and the cheese's flavour is expressed finally in that cave over the months of patient aging. Change any part of that chain, the altitude, the meadow, the season, the cave conditions, and you change the cheese. This is why in the year 2001 Gruyere received protected designation of origin status under European law. Not as a marketing exercise. As a factual description, this thing can only be this thing if it comes from this place. It is not transferable. There is a French concept, the word terroir, that wine people use constantly, and that I think gets a little overused in food writing generally, but which applies here with absolute precision. Terroir, the complete natural environment in which a particular food is produced and the way that environment expresses itself in the final flavour. The valley is in the cheese, the mountain is in the cheese, the specific angle of the sunlight on that particular hillside is in some molecularly traceable way in the cheese, which means that every time someone in Tokyo or New York or Sydney unwraps a piece of genuine aged Gruyere, and there are strict production controls that make the genuine article identifiable. They're in some small but real way eating the Fribourg Alps, eating the 12th century, eating the solution to a problem that a dairy farmer solved 900 years ago with nothing but milk, salt, thyme and a cool stone cave. I find that extraordinary. I genuinely do. Now, across the valley from the Gruyere district in the area surrounding the town of Emmental in the canton of Bern, a different solution to the same problem produced something that became perhaps the most visually recognizable cheese in the world. Emmental, the one with the holes. And before I go any further, yes, we are going to talk about the holes, because the holes are not a quirk. They are not decorative. They are evidence. They are a record written in the body of the cheese itself of exactly what happened during fermentation and how well it went. During the aging process of Emmental, the specific bacteria used in its production, primarily a strain called Propionibacterium freudenreichii, which I mention only because the full name is magnificent and sounds like something from a science fiction novel, consume the lactic acid produced during fermentation and release carbon dioxide gas as a byproduct. That gas, trapped within the solid mass of the cheese as it forms, creates bubbles. Those bubbles, as the cheese ages and the rind hardens around them, become the holes. The correct technical term is eyes, which I think is a far more poetic description than holes, and which I intend to use exclusively from this point on. The eyes of a well-made Emmental should be according to the traditional standards codified in Swiss dairy regulations, cherry-sized to walnut-sized, evenly distributed, round not irregular. The inside surface of each eye should be slightly glossy, a sign that the cheese was moist and active during formation. A wheel with two small eyes was over-acidified during production. A wheel with irregular, cracked eyes was aged too cold or turned too infrequently. A wheel with almost no eyes was made from milk that was too low in the right bacterial cultures. The cheesemaker reads the eyes the way a doctor reads an X-ray. The cheese tells you everything if you know how to look. The earliest documented references to Emmental-style cheese production in the Bern region date to the year 1400. By the 17th century it was being exported across the Alps into northern Italy and westward into France, carried on pack mules along the same mountain passes that Roman traders had used a millennium and a half earlier. The Emmental wheel in its mature form weighs between 75 and 120 kilograms, considerably heavier than a large man, which made it simultaneously a very valuable trade commodity and an absolutely terrible thing to drop on your foot. And here is the social dimension of cheese production that I think deserves its own moment of attention, because it is connected to something we discussed much earlier in the evening, the way that isolation forces cooperation. Making Emmental or any large Alpine hard cheese was not something a single family could do on their own. The wheels required enormous quantities of milk. A single, full-sized wheel of Emmental requires approximately 1,200 litres of fresh milk to produce. 1,200 litres. A single cow in a good summer season might produce 3,000 to 4,000 litres across the whole year, so one wheel of cheese represents the milk production of roughly one cow for a full third of the year, or the combined daily output of a small herd for weeks at a time. No single Alpine dairy family had enough milk to make enough cheese to make the operation worthwhile on their own, and so they shared. The practice of cooperative dairy production, pooling the milk of multiple families' herds making cheese collectively and then dividing the output proportionally, gave rise to the Alpine cheese cooperative, the Käserei, or Dairy Association, which was already a functioning institution in many Swiss and Austrian valleys by the 14th century. Members kept strict records of how many litres of milk each family contributed each day. The cheesemaker was a specialist hired collectively whose skills were too expensive for any single family to afford but perfectly reasonable to share. The cave where the cheese aged was communal property, its shelves allocated according to contribution. At the end of the season, each family received their portion of wheels sized according to what they had put in. This is a functioning cooperative economy, organised around a perishable agricultural surplus operating at the valley level, documented in Swiss canton records going back 7 centuries. The next time someone tells you that cooperation is a modern or an idealistic concept, you can tell them about the cheese cave. It was working fine in the year 1300. The cold air of the cave is beginning to feel comfortable now. Your eyes have adjusted to the dim light coming through the doorway. The smell, that complex living mineral smell, has become something you are breathing naturally rather than noticing consciously. The wheels on the shelves around you are patient in the way that only things measured in months can be patient. They are not finished yet. They are still becoming. And as we step back out into the light of the valley, out of the cool dark and into the afternoon where the village is beginning to stir with the particular energy of midday, there is one place we have not yet been. One space that was in many ways the true centre of valley social life. Not the mill, not the farmhouse, not the cave, the square. And what happened there in the brief golden hours between the morning's work and the afternoon's resumption is a story about time itself, about what it means to stop deliberately and collectively, and simply be present together in a place. That is where we're going next. Step out of the cave with me, back into the light, back into the valley afternoon where the sun has finally cleared the eastern ridge and is doing its best to warm the stone walls of the houses along the main path. The air smells of pine resin and the particular dry grass scent of late summer, and somewhere nearby a dog is barking at something it has already forgotten the reason for. It is midday. or close enough to midday that nobody here is measuring the difference. And something is happening in the village square that I want you to notice. Not a ceremony, not a market day, not any occasion that would appear in a historical record or be mentioned in a parish chronicle. Just the simple, daily, completely unremarkable fact that people are gathering, drifting toward the square the way water drifts toward the lowest point in a landscape. Not because anyone organized it, not because anyone announced it, but because it is midday, and midday is when you come to the square, and that is simply how things work. There is a stone fountain at the centre. There almost always is in the villages of the Western Alps and the Pyrenees. The fountain is the oldest piece of public infrastructure in most of these communities, predating the church in some cases, or at least predating the current church building. Water from the mountain, spring above the village, runs continuously through a stone channel into a carved basin, and from there overflows into a lower basin used for washing, and from there drains into a channel that runs along the edge of the square and eventually joins the stream below the mill. The fountain never stops. Day and night, summer and winter, the water runs. And the square it anchors has been the social centre of this community for longer than the oldest person in the village can remember being told. Let me take you to a specific place, because I think the specific is always more honest than the general. The village of Saint-Engrâce, tucked at the extreme southern end of the Pyrénées-Atlantiques department in southwestern France, sits in a valley so remote that until the mid-20th century, the single road connecting it to the outside world was unpaved, narrow and impassable in winter. The valley is a geological wonder, a deep limestone gorge with walls that rise nearly 300 metres on either side, carved by the Ahaicha River over millions of years. It is extraordinarily beautiful, and for most of its history it was extraordinarily isolated. The community that survived in this valley for centuries developed a social structure that historians of rural French life have found particularly well documented, partly because the local church kept unusually detailed records going back to the early 16th century, and partly because a French ethnographer named Michel Duvert spent considerable time in the region in the 1970s and 80s, recording the practices and memories of elderly residents whose grandparents had grown up in the pre-modern version of this world. What Duvert found and what the church record supported was a midday social life of remarkable consistency and remarkable intentionality. Between roughly 11 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, the exact timing shifting with the season and the agricultural demands of the week, the square in front of the church in Saint-Engrâce was the place where the community governed itself. Not formally, not with written agendas or elected officials standing at a podium, but with the particular efficiency of a small community in which everyone knows everyone, every piece of information is relevant to someone, and the gap between a conversation and a decision is often no wider than a nod. News was exchanged here first. Before it reached individual households, before it was confirmed or denied or embellished in private, it entered the community through the square. Someone had seen the road above the village blocked by a rock fall. Someone's oldest daughter was coming back from service in the city at the end of the month. The shepherd who had gone up to the high pasture 2 weeks ago had sent word that the third cow was limping. The price of wool had dropped at the market in the town below. None of this required a newspaper or a notice board or a messenger on horseback. It required people standing near a fountain in the middle of the day talking to each other, which they did reliably every day, which meant that information moved through this community with a speed and completeness that we who have instant access to every fact in the world and still somehow manage to be completely uninformed about what our immediate neighbours are doing might find quietly humbling. But here is the dimension of the village square that I find most worth sitting with. The square was also where disputes were resolved, or at least where they began to be resolved. where the first public acknowledgement was made that a problem existed, where the community's collective opinion began to form before anything went to the curé or the local magistrate or any formal authority. In a community of 200 or 300 people, everyone who mattered to a dispute was almost certainly present in the square at midday. The two families who disagreed about the boundary of a field, the shepherd accused of letting his animals graze on land that was not his, the widow who believed her neighbour's roof was draining water onto a vegetable garden. These were not minor inconveniences. In a subsistence economy, they were existential questions, and they were addressed first and most effectively through the mechanism of community opinion, through the entirely unwritten but perfectly understood pressure of what everyone around you thinks of your behaviour. The anthropologist Pierre Bourdieu, who did some of his most important fieldwork in the traditional communities of the Béarn region of the French Pyrenees, not far from Saint-Angras in the 1960s, described this as the economy of symbolic capital. The idea that in a small closed community what other people think of you has direct practical consequences for your life. Your reputation determines whether you can borrow a tool from your neighbour in an emergency, whether people will help you bring in your harvest when the weather turns, whether your son or daughter will find a suitable marriage partner in the valley. Reputation was not a soft social currency. In these communities it was as real and as necessary as grain or firewood, and the village square at midday was where reputation was built and damaged and repaired day by day over the course of a lifetime. Does that sound exhausting? I understand if it does. There is a version of this that feels claustrophobic. The constant visibility, the sense that nothing you do is entirely private. And I think that is a real cost of this kind of community life, that romanticised accounts of rural history tend to gloss over, but there is also something in it. Something about the accountability that comes from being genuinely known by the people around you, not just known in the surface, way we're known by our social media followers, but known in the deep longitudinal way that comes from sharing a valley and a water source and a bread oven for generations. That feels like something we have lost and that we perhaps do not fully have a replacement for. Think about the loneliness statistics of the modern world and then think about a community where you are structurally, unavoidably, thoroughly embedded in the lives of the people around you. There is a trade-off there. I am not saying one is simply better than the other. But I think it is worth noticing the trade-off honestly rather than pretending the modern arrangement is only gain and no loss. In the Aosta Valley, that remarkable finger of Italian territory that pushes up between France and Switzerland into the Western Alps, where the regional language is still a Franco-Provençal dialect that sounds nothing like standard Italian and everything like something much older, the village squares had a specific additional function that I find genuinely charming. They were courts of informal arbitration for the management of what the local tradition called les communes, the commons, the shared resources of the valley community, the high pastures, the forests, the water channels, the paths. These were managed not by any individual landowner, not by the feudal lord, but by the community collectively through a set of customary rules that had evolved over centuries and that were administered, revised and enforced through communal decisions made in places exactly like the village square at midday. There are records from the Aosta Valley dating from the 13th century onward of these communal management agreements, called chartes de commune in the Franco-Provençal tradition, that lay out in extraordinary detail the rules governing who could cut how much wood from the communal forest and when and with what tools, who had the right to water their animals at which point in the irrigation channel and in what rotation, what penalties applied to someone who grazed more animals than their share on the communal high pasture. These documents are in the language of modern political science examples of what the economist Elinor Ostrom called the governance of the commons, the management of shared resources by the communities that depend on them without privatization and without top-down state control. Ostrom won the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in the year 2009 partly for demonstrating that communities across history had solved the problem of shared resource management far more effectively and sustainably than the dominant economic theory of her era had assumed was possible. The people of the Alster Valley did not know they were solving a Nobel Prize-level problem. They were just trying to make sure everyone had enough wood for winter without destroying the forest that everyone depended on. They did it by talking to each other in the village square. For several hundred years. The sun has moved west enough now that the shadow of the church tower is beginning to reach across the square. The conversations are winding down. The bread has been eaten, the water drunk, the news exchanged, the quiet observations made and registered. People are beginning to drift back to their separate lives and their afternoon's work. The square does not empty quickly. It empties the way it filled, gradually without urgency, one person at a time deciding that the moment has come to go back. There is no bell, no announcement, no signal, just the collective intuitive sense that the midday is done. In an hour the square will be nearly empty, the fountain will still be running, the dog will still be barking at whatever it is, and the valley will have settled back into its productive afternoon silence. But not everyone has gone back to the fields or the barn. Up the slope in a small house on the edge of the village, just above where the stone path meets the forest track, a woman is working at a table near the only window. The light falls across her hands. On the table in front of her are bundles of dried plants, leaves, roots, bark, seeds, collected over the summer from specific places on the mountain that she knows by name and visits every year at exactly the right time. She's not a doctor. There is no doctor in this valley. The nearest physician is a day and a half away on foot, and in winter the pass is closed entirely. She is something older than a doctor, and what she knows, what she carries in her hands and her memory accumulated over decades and passed down from the woman who taught her, and the woman who taught that woman in an unbroken chain that stretches back into a time before anyone thought to write anything down, is the next thing I want to tell you about. Her name does not appear in any official record, not in the parish register, not in the tax ledger, not in the land survey that the canton commissioned in the early 18th century. The men who compiled those documents were not looking for her. She was not the kind of person those documents were designed to see, but she appears everywhere else. She appears in the private letters of a farmer's wife in the Engadine Valley, who wrote in the winter of 1743 that her youngest child had been brought through a dangerous fever by the woman at the top of the village path who came without being asked and stayed without being invited and left when the child was breathing normally again. She appears in the margin notes of a parish priest in the Carpathian foothills of what is now Romania, who recorded with a mixture of admiration and theological unease that the old woman everyone called upon in cases of illness seemed to achieve results that he could not explain and was not entirely sure he approved of. She appears in the memories of elderly people across the Alpine arc collected by ethnographers in the 20th century, who described her in the same terms regardless of which valley they came from, which language they spoke, which country had drawn its border through their mountain. She was the person you went to when there was no one else to go to, and in a remote European valley before the age of modern roads, that meant she was the person you went to for almost everything. Let me give you some real numbers because I think they reframe this story significantly. In rural Switzerland in the year 1700, the nearest trained physician, meaning someone who had attended a university medical faculty and held a formal degree, was for most Alpine Valley communities between 1 and 3 days' travel away on foot. In winter, with the passes closed, that journey was not 1 day or 3 days. It was impossible. A study of medical geography in early modern Switzerland, published by historians at the University of Bern, estimated that for the majority of the rural Alpine population, before the mid-19th century, access to formally trained medical practitioners was effectively zero for between 4 and 6 months of every year. Zero. Not limited, not difficult. Zero. Into that gap stepped a tradition of herbal medicine wound care midwifery, and what we might today loosely call palliative care, that was practiced almost entirely by women, transmitted almost entirely through direct apprenticeship from one generation to the next, and built on a body of observational knowledge accumulated over centuries that was in many respects more practically effective for the conditions these communities faced than what the university-trained physician in the city was offering. That last point is not romantic exaggeration. It is a documented historical reality that medical historians have been quietly assembling for several decades. The formal medicine of the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe was, to put it charitably, a work in progress. Bloodletting was still standard practice for a bewildering range of conditions. Mercury was regularly administered for ailments it made significantly worse. The theoretical framework of humoral medicine, inherited from ancient Greek sources built around the idea that health depended on the balance of 4 bodily fluids, had very little to do with what was actually happening inside a sick person's body. Meanwhile, the woman in the valley with her bundles of dried herbs was working from a different kind of knowledge entirely. Not theoretical, empirical. She knew what she knew because she had watched what worked and what did not over many years in real patients who lived in the same valley she lived in, with the same diet, the same physical demands, the same vulnerabilities to cold and damp and altitude. The plants she used were the plants that grew where she lived, and some of them were extraordinarily effective. Arnica montana, mountain arnica, grows throughout the Alps and the Carpathians, a yellow-flowered daisy-like plant found on the high meadows and rocky slopes above the tree line. Alpine valley healers used it externally as a compress or poultice for bruising sprains and the muscle injuries that were an almost daily feature of physical agricultural life. Modern pharmacological research has confirmed that arnica contains compounds called sesquiterpene lactones that have genuine anti-inflammatory properties. The valley women did not know the chemistry, but they knew the outcome because they'd been watching it for generations. Gentiana lutea, the great yellow gentian with its dramatic tall flower spike visible from some distance on the Alpine meadow, was used throughout the Alpine arc as a digestive bitter. The dried and powdered root was administered in cases of stomach illness, loss of appetite, and the weakness that followed fever. It is now one of the most studied of all European medicinal plants, and the bitter compounds it contains, the gentiopicroside and amaragentin, are among the most intensely bitter substances known with documented effects on digestive enzyme secretion. Today, gentian root is a standard ingredient in a number of European herbal bitters and digestive liqueurs. The tradition did not die. It just changed its container. Yarrow, Achillea millefolium, the common yarrow, was perhaps the most widely used wound herb in the entire European herbal tradition. Its folk names across different languages are almost universally variations on the theme of stopping blood in German Schafgarbe, in French herbeau charpentier, carpenter's herb for the same reason. Applied as a fresh crushed poultice to a cut or abrasion, it had a documented astringent and mild antimicrobial effect. In a world where any wound that became infected was potentially fatal, where a bad cut on a farm tool in January with the pass closed and no physician reachable could mean losing a limb or a life, having something effective for wound care was not a minor convenience, it was survival. Now here is what I find particularly moving about this tradition. The knowledge was written down eventually, beginning in the 15th and 16th centuries when printing made it possible to produce and distribute illustrated herbals, and when the Renaissance's general enthusiasm for recovering and codifying ancient knowledge created a market for books about plants and their uses. The great herbals of the period, the work of Leonhard Fuchs in the 1540s, the extraordinary illustrated volumes of Pier Andrea Mattioli published through the 1550s and 60s, the Kräuterbuch of Hieronymus Bock, these were serious, detailed, beautifully produced books that attempted to bring together the accumulated plant knowledge of Europe into printed form. But here is the honest thing about those books. The men who wrote them, and they were almost all men writing for a university-educated audience that was almost entirely male, were in many cases drawing on the same oral tradition that the valley women held. They were meeting that tradition at the market, at the pharmacy, at the roadside. They were writing down what people had known for a very long time and presenting it in a form that the educated world would take seriously because it was in Latin and had footnotes. The knowledge moved from the hands of women into the pages of books written by men who were given credit for it. This is not a new observation. Historians of early modern medicine have made it for decades. But it is worth saying plainly because it adds a layer of complexity to this story that I think deserves acknowledgement. There is one figure who stands slightly apart from this pattern and who connects the formal medical world to the Alpine herbal tradition in a way that is genuinely fascinating. Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, better known to history by the name he gave himself, Paracelsus, was born in the year 1493 in the village of Einsiedeln in the Swiss canton of Schwyz in the foothills of the Alps. He became one of the most disruptive and controversial medical thinkers in European history, the man who told the medical establishment of his era loudly, and with what his contemporaries found quite exhausting personal confidence, that their ancient theoretical frameworks were wrong, that medicine needed to be based on direct observation and practical experiment, and that more genuine medical knowledge could be found among the practical healers of rural communities than in all the libraries of the universities combined. He was difficult. He was frequently wrong in interesting ways while being right about important things, and his insistence that the plants and minerals of specific local landscapes held medicinal properties that could not be replicated by substances from elsewhere, that medicine was in some sense geographically specific, was a direct echo of the knowledge tradition practiced by the women in the valleys surrounding the community where he grew up. He did not give them credit, which was typical for the era, but the intellectual inheritance is there in his work, plain to see if you know what you're looking for. Can I ask you something genuinely? Is there someone in your own family history, a grandmother, a great-aunt, someone's mother's mother, who knew things about plants or food, or the treatment of ordinary illness that seemed to come from somewhere deep, from a knowledge that was not in any book you ever saw, I ask, because I think most of us, if we go back far enough, find exactly this tradition in our own family trees. The knowledge was everywhere in every community until very recently. What changed was not the knowledge. What changed was who we decided to listen to. The afternoon light in the healer's workroom is fading slightly. The bundles of dried herbs cast faint shadows on the whitewashed wall. She has finished what she was doing, a preparation of something wrapped carefully in a cloth, and set it aside on the shelf with the other things waiting to be needed. In the valley of the Engadin, in the Swiss canton of Graubünden, the late 19th century folklorist Christian Schorter documented more than 300 individual plant preparations in common use among the valley communities gathered from interviews with elderly women who'd been practicing since the mid-1800s. 300. A working pharmacopoeia held entirely in human memory passed entirely through direct teaching, operating without a pharmacy license or a medical degree or a single official document authorizing any of it. 300 remedies for a community of a few thousand people, for every condition from a child's fever to an old man's cough to the grief that follows loss, which these women treated with as much seriousness as any physical illness, because they understood something that formal medicine was very slow to catch up to that grief and worry and prolonged sadness have physical consequences, and that those consequences deserve care. The preparation on the shelf will be taken across the village later this evening to the household that needs it, but right now something outside is drawing my attention. From somewhere farther down the valley path, from the direction of the small stone building at the edge of the village, with the single window and the straw on the floor, and the one long wooden bench where children sit pressed shoulder to shoulder in the cold months, there is a sound. The sound of young voices reciting something in unison, a lesson, something being learned and repeated and learned again, not from a printed page. Most of the children in this room have never held a printed page, but from a voice patient and steady at the front of the room, asking and answering and asking again. The sound of a valley teaching its young what it knows, and what that teaching looked like, how children grew up learning in these remote places what they were taught and by whom, and with what extraordinary combination of limitations and unexpected gifts, is the story we're walking toward right now. Walk toward that sound with me. Down the path from the healer's house past the fountain in the square still running its constant quiet thread of mountain water, past the barn where someone's horse is shifting its weight in the afternoon warmth. The sound gets clearer as you approach. Young voices, maybe a dozen of them, maybe 20, reciting something together in a rhythm that sounds almost like singing but is not quite singing. And then underneath the chorus, a single adult voice, lower, steadier, asking a question you cannot quite make out. The school is a single room. Of course it is. There's only ever one room. That is not a limitation anyone apologizes for. It is simply the shape of the thing, the same shape it has in the valley, 2 ridges over and the valley beyond that, and in the highland communities of western Norway, where the winter lasts 8 months, and the children can only reach the schoolhouse by walking across a frozen lake, and in the communities of the Scottish Highlands where in the early 19th century a survey by the Church of Scotland found parish schools serving catchment areas so large and so mountainous that some children were walking more than 8 miles each way to attend. 8 miles each way in the Scottish Highlands in November, and they went. Because the alternative was not going, and not going meant something their parents understood with absolute clarity, even if the children were still figuring it out. Let me give you the particular picture of one of these schools, because the general tends to flatten what the specific makes vivid. In the canton of Graubünden in eastern Switzerland, the largest Swiss canton by area, and historically one of the most linguistically complex places in Europe, where 3 distinct languages, German, Italian and Romansh, were spoken in adjacent valleys that sometimes could not easily communicate with each other. The question of schooling in remote communities was a practical problem of considerable difficulty. The terrain made it almost impossible to consolidate students into a single building. The winters made it almost impossible to keep a school open year-round. And the agricultural calendar made it almost impossible to have children sitting in a room when the fields needed hands. The solution that most of these communities arrived at independently and over time was seasonal schooling. School in winter, field and forest and pasture in the warmer months. The academic year, such as it was, ran roughly from November through February or March. The months when the snow was too deep for most outdoor work, when the daylight hours were too short to accomplish much in the fields, when the family was largely confined indoors anyway, and the presence of children in a warm building was not actually removing them from anything productive. This was not laziness. This was not indifference to education. This was a pragmatic recognition that the community's survival depended on every able pair of hands during the agricultural seasons, and that the children who attended school in winter were the same children who drove cattle, harvested grain, gathered firewood, and helped with the cheese-making the rest of the year. They were not growing up slowly because no one cared. They were growing up at the pace that the mountain set, and the mountain, as we have established by now, had a very clear sense of what needed to happen when. The teacher in this one-room winter school was frequently not a trained educator in any formal sense. In the Germanic Alpine tradition, the schoolmaster was often the village organist or the church sexton, or in some cases simply the most literate adult male in the community, who could be persuaded to take on the role for a combination of modest payment and community status. His qualifications were primarily the ability to read, the ability to do basic arithmetic, and the patience to manage 20 children of wildly different ages in a single cold room for several hours a day. Patience. That one is not to be underestimated. Because the one-room school, for all its obvious logistical challenges, had an educational dynamic that modern pedagogical research has looked at with some genuine interest. In a room where children range from 6 years old to 14, the older students inevitably become part of the teaching process. Not because anyone planned it that way, but because the younger children watch the older ones ask the older ones questions, learn by proximity and observation, as much as by direct instruction. The older students, for their part, consolidate their own knowledge by explaining it. There is a body of educational research developed substantially in the 20th century, suggesting that the act of teaching something to someone else is one of the most effective ways to deeply understand it yourself. The one-room school was accidentally doing something that progressive educators would spend considerable effort trying to replicate 300 years later. Now here is a name I want to introduce into this story because his thinking connects directly to the world we have been describing all evening, and because I think he deserves to be better known outside of the specialized history of education where he currently lives. Johann Heinrich Pestalozzi, born in the year 1746 in Zurich, Swiss. The son of a physician raised in modest circumstances after his father died young, and by any reasonable measure one of the most important educational thinkers who ever lived, a man whose ideas about how children learn changed the basic structure of formal schooling across Europe and eventually across the world, and who arrived at those ideas specifically because he spent years working directly with the rural poor of the Swiss countryside. Pestalozzi believed something that was in the educational philosophy of his era close to radical. He believed that children learn best not through rote memorization and rigid repetition of abstract rules, but through direct experience, through the use of their own senses, through connection between what is being learned and what is actually present in the child's immediate world. He called this method Anschauung, a German word that does not translate perfectly, but means something close to direct perception, or learning through seeing and touching and experiencing rather than through being told. He tested these ideas not in a university seminar, but in a school he established in the ruins of a castle at Burgdorf in the canton of Bern in the early 1800s, working with children who were among the most economically marginal in Switzerland. Children who came to him malnourished, without shoes in winter, speaking dialects so thick that Pestalozzi himself sometimes struggled to understand them. And what he found was that these children who had grown up in the valleys and the fields, who'd been learning to read landscape and weather and animal behavior since before they could read letters, were not deficient learners. They were differently prepared learners. They had knowledge. It was just knowledge that the formal educational system of his era had no framework for recognizing. His most famous text, published in the year 1801 and translated into English as How Gertrude Teaches Her Children, is structured as a series of letters describing his method. The mother, Gertrude, is the model teacher, not a university man with a Latin degree. A mother in a village teaching her children in the kitchen through conversation and daily activity, and the natural questions that arise from a life lived in contact with the real world. He was describing in educational theory something very close to what had been happening organically in the valley communities we've been walking through all evening. There is something quietly moving about that to me. The idea that the educational philosophy that eventually shaped how children are taught across much of the modern world had its roots traceable and documented in the observation of how ordinary people in Swiss mountain communities were already raising their children. The theory came later, the practice had always been there. But let me tell you something about the Norwegian model because it adds a dimension to this story that I find particularly striking. In the remote coastal and inland communities of Norway, communities that were in terms of physical isolation from central authority and formal infrastructure comparable to the Alpine valleys in almost every relevant way, the tradition of what Norwegian historians call omgangsskole developed as the primary model of rural education from the 17th century through well into the 19th. The word means roughly the travelling school, and it worked exactly as it sounds. Rather than fixing the school in a single building that children came to the schoolmaster, the omgangsskoleholder, travelled from farm to farm throughout the community on a rotation, spending a week or two at each household, teaching the children of that household in the farmhouse kitchen or the main living room before moving on to the next farm on the circuit. The parents provided the teacher's board and lodging while he was at their farm. The children of the immediate household got his full attention for the duration of his stay, and the community as a whole spread across dozens of farms that might be separated by significant distances of mountain or fjord, received a form of education that came to them rather than requiring them to come to it. Norwegian church records documenting the omgangsskole system show it operating in rural parishes as early as the 1680s. A royal ordinance of the year 1739 formally mandated the provision of instruction in reading Christian catechism and basic arithmetic to all Norwegian children, including those in the most remote rural communities. The omgangsskole was the practical mechanism by which this mandate was implemented in the countryside because no other mechanism was logistically possible. The subjects taught were not wide: reading, religious catechism, basic arithmetic. Perhaps some writing, though writing was considered a more advanced skill than reading, and not always included in the rural curriculum. The goal was functional literacy, the ability to read a Bible, understand a legal document, calculate a fair exchange, not scholarship, not the kind of education that prepared someone for university. The kind of education that prepared someone to navigate the world of their community with their eyes open and their wits sharpened. And can I make a small observation here, one that I find genuinely worth thinking about? The children who grew up in these valley schools, the ones who sat on the wooden bench in the cold room and recited their catechism and learned to count on their fingers and walked 8 miles through the Scottish rain to do it, were not developing the kind of restless, continuous, always-on engagement with new information that we've come to think of as intellectual activity. They were developing something different: depth rather than breadth, patience rather than speed, the capacity to sit with the thing, to return to it, to know it the way you know a path you've walked every day for 10 years, rather than the way you know a place you visited once and photographed. Their education was slow in the same way their bread was slow, and in the same way the slowness was not a flaw. It was the method. The voices in the schoolroom are quieter now. The afternoon lesson is ending the way Alpine afternoons end. Gradually, by feel rather than by clock, the light through the single small window, shifting from bright to softer gold as the sun drops toward the western ridge. The children will go home to their families, they will carry water, they will help with the animals, they will sit at the table while their parents finish the day's last tasks and the fire burns lower and the room gets dim. And in the houses across the valley in the fading light, another kind of work is beginning. The kind of work that cannot be done outdoors, cannot be done in summer, cannot be done quickly, and cannot be done without hands that know exactly what they are doing. Hands holding a knife, hands holding thread, Hands that have been practicing the same movements since childhood, year after year, winter after winter, until the work lives somewhere below conscious thought and becomes as natural as breathing. The craftsman is lighting his lamp, and what he makes in that lamplight, what these valley winters produced in carved wood and woven thread and beaten metal, is one of the most extraordinary stories of creativity born from confinement that I have ever come across, and that is exactly where we are headed. The lamp is a small thing, tallow most likely rendered animal fat in a shallow iron dish with a twisted wick of plant fibre giving off a flame about the size of a thumbnail and a faint, slightly unpleasant smell that no one in this farmhouse has ever thought to notice because it is simply the smell of evening. The light it casts is warm and narrow. It illuminates roughly the space of a large book held at arm's length. Beyond that radius, the room falls into a soft, graduated darkness that deepens toward the corners and disappears entirely into the ceiling. This is the craftsman's working light. Not ideal by any measure we would apply today. Your optometrist would have significant concerns. But it is what there is, and what there is turns out to be enough because the hands doing this work do not especially need to see. They have done this so many times through so many winters that the movements live below the level of vision. The eyes guide, the hands remember. On the workbench in front of him, a wide plank set across two sawhorses worn smooth by decades of use. There is a block of wood roughly the size of a man's two fists pressed together. Linden wood, most likely. Soft enough to carve without excessive force. Tight-grained enough to hold fine detail without splitting. Chosen specifically from the linden trees on the lower slopes of the valley, cut in autumn when the sap had retreated into the roots, dried for a full year in the barn loft before being brought inside. He picks up the smallest of his gouges, sets the edge against the wood, and begins. What I want to tell you about now is one of the most quietly extraordinary stories of economic transformation in European history, a story that begins with snow isolation and 5 months of enforced indoor time, and ends with a small valley in the South Tyrolean Alps, becoming by the early 19th century the largest producer of decorative wooden carvings in the entire world. The valley is called Val Gardena in Italian. In German was the language its people spoke and still speak today. It is called Grödnertal. It sits in what is now the autonomous province of South Tyrol in northeastern Italy, a narrow valley cut by the Gardena River into the Dolomite Mountains, surrounded on every side by rock formations so dramatic and so geometrically improbable that the first time you see photographs of them, you're quite certain someone has edited the sky. The valley floor sits at roughly 1,500 meters above sea level. The surrounding peaks reach nearly 3,000. The agricultural land is limited. The winters are long, cold and definitive, and at some point in the early 17th century the earliest documented references to professional wood carving as an economic activity in the valley date to around the 1640s and 1650s. The people of Grödnertal made a collective discovery that changed their economic destiny permanently. They were very, very good at this. The specific tradition of wood carving in the valley almost certainly predates the 17th century by a considerable margin. People in mountain valleys had been carving wood for their own use, spoons, bowls, tool handles, furniture fittings, religious figures for the household shrine for as long as they had been living there. The technical skills were not new. What was new in the 17th century was the market. As trade routes across the Alps became more reliable, as the movement of merchants and goods through the mountain passes increased, as the cities of northern Italy and Central Europe developed an appetite for devotional objects, decorative figures, and the small carved nativity scene. Figures, the Krippe figures, exquisitely detailed miniature representations of the Christmas story that were becoming fashionable in educated Catholic households across the continent, The carvers of Grudnertal found that what they made in their winter evenings by lamplight was not just useful to their own community, it was wanted, widely, increasingly urgently, and it could be sold. The Grudner Kramer the Grudner peddlers became a feature of the commercial landscape of Central Europe from the mid-17th century onward. These were men from the valley who loaded their carved goods into large packs and literally walked out of the mountains in spring, travelling extraordinary distances across the continent to sell what the valley had made during the winter. There are documented accounts of Grudner peddlers reaching Amsterdam in the west and Vienna and Budapest in the east, selling carved figures from packs worn on their backs, speaking enough of whatever language was needed to complete a transaction, and returning to the valley in autumn with cash that would support the next winter's production. By the early 19th century, the valley's output had grown into something that operated more like an industry than a cottage craft. A survey of Grudnertal conducted in the 1820s found that the majority of households in the valley were involved in wood carving to some degree, some as full carvers, producing complete figures from raw block to finished surface, others specializing in specific stages of production. One family might rough carve the basic form, another might do the finish carving of faces and hands, another might apply the painted detail that gave the figures their particular character. A division of labour operating within a single valley organised entirely through informal family and community relationships, producing a product that was exported across a continent. And the quality. Let me try to give you a sense of what the quality actually meant. The nativity figures, the creeper pieces that came from the best Grudnertal carvers in their peak period, were not naive folk art in any dismissive sense of that phrase. They were technically accomplished, anatomically detailed, emotionally expressive works in miniature. The faces carved with tools the width of a matchstick had specific expressions, not generic piety but individual character. An old shepherd with a particular tiredness around the eyes, a young woman whose posture suggested she had just been surprised by something and not yet fully recovered from it. Animals with the specific weight and muscle memory of animals that the carver had watched every day of his life in the valley. The carver knew how a cow stood because he had stood next to cows his entire life. He knew how an elderly man's hands looked because he had held those hands. The work was precise because the observation behind it was precise. The art was inseparable from the life. I think about this sometimes in relation to the way we talk about authenticity in creative work. There is a version of the conversation about authentic creative expression that focuses almost entirely on emotional sincerity. Feel it deeply enough, and the work will be true. But the Grudnertal tradition suggests something more demanding, that deep technical skill and deep experiential knowledge accumulated slowly over years are also forms of authenticity. The carver's hand knew what it knew because it had practiced for 10,000 hours, and what it had practiced had always been connected to what was directly in front of him: the landscape, the animals, the faces, the light. You cannot fake that. Not really. Now let me take you somewhere completely different geographically, because the story of wintercraft in the European valleys does not belong to carving alone. The town of Idrija sits in a valley in what is now western Slovenia, roughly 40 kilometers from the Adriatic coast, surrounded by forested hills that hold the town in a natural bowl. It is famous for two things that seem at first glance to have nothing in common: one of the largest mercury mines in the world, discovered in the late 15th century and worked for nearly 500 years, and a tradition of handmade bobbin lace, Idrija lace of extraordinary delicacy and technical complexity, that developed alongside the mining culture and was recognized by the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization as an intangible cultural heritage in the year 2018. The connection between the mercury mine and the lace is not incidental. It is the story. When the mercury mine at Idrija began operating in earnest in the early 16th century, it drew male workers from across the region. The town grew rapidly around the mining enterprise. The miners' wives, daughters and sisters found themselves in a community where the primary source of income was monopolized by underground labor that was definitionally male in a world where the economic options for women were tightly constrained. Lace making was one answer. Not lace made on a machine, this was entirely handwork using dozens of small wooden bobbins wound with fine thread, each bobbin manipulated individually to create a complex interlacing pattern that built up stitch by stitch into fabric of extraordinary fineness. A single square centimetre of fine Idria lace might involve 20 or 30 individual thread manipulations. A piece of moderate complexity took days, a truly ambitious piece. A ceremonial collar, a length of altar cloth might represent months of work by a skilled maker sitting at her lace pillow for several hours each day in every window of available light. The earliest documented evidence of organised lace production in Idrija dates to the early 17th century. By the 18th century, the tradition was systematic enough that the town established a lace school, one of the first formal craft schools in the region, to ensure that the technical knowledge was reliably transmitted to the next generation, not as a charitable gesture, as an economic investment. The lace was being sold. It was generating real income. Teaching the next generation to make it well was simply good business. A Viennese merchant's inventory from the year 1753 lists Idria lace alongside imported textiles from France and the Netherlands, which were at that time the dominant centres of European luxury textile production. The fact that a product from a small mining town in a Slovenian valley was sitting in the same commercial category as the finest French and Dutch lace tells you something quite specific about the level of quality being achieved. Can I ask you something? 'Cause I'm genuinely curious. When you handle something handmade, a piece of cloth, a carved object, something that took time and skill and a particular pair of hands to produce, does it feel different to you than something manufactured? Not sentimentally, physically. Does it feel different in your hands? I think most people, if they are honest, will say yes. And I think the reason it feels different is that it carries information that manufactured objects do not. The trace of the hand that made it. The small variations that are the signature of a living process rather than a mechanical one. The knowledge that somewhere in the chain of its making, a person sat in a certain kind of light and paid a certain kind of attention for a certain number of hours to this specific thing. That information is real. It is encoded in the object, and we feel it even when we cannot exactly explain what we are feeling. The craftsman's lamp has been burning for 2 hours now. The block of linden wood has become something. Not finished, there are at least 3 more evenings of work before this particular piece is done, but unmistakably something. A shape that was not in the wood before he began, brought forward from the material by the accumulated knowledge in his hands. He sets the gouge down, flexes his fingers against the cold which has crept back into the room as the cachalophan's warmth gradually diminishes toward the end of the day. Tilts the piece in the lamplight to see where the shadow falls and what the shadow reveals. Across the valley in other farmhouses, other pairs of hands are finishing their evening work in other kinds of light. A woman in the house by the mill is finishing the last rows of a piece of cloth on a loom that has been set up in the corner of the main room since October. An old man 2 farms up the slope is sharpening tools by feel in near darkness, the whetstone moving in a rhythm so familiar it requires no conscious attention at all. The valley is settling. The work of the day and of the long evening is almost done. In perhaps an hour, those scattered lamplight pools will begin to go dark one by one across the valley floor. The families will draw inward toward the hearth. The cachalofen still faintly warm will anchor the room, and then something will happen that is in its way the oldest form of entertainment. Human beings have ever devised something that happens to be where several things we know about these valleys come together in a single warm room, with the fire low and the snow outside and the whole dark night ahead. Someone is going to start talking, and what they say and how they say it and what those words carried across the centuries, that is the story that comes next. The tools are put away now. The carving gouge is back on its shelf. The loom has gone quiet. The last task of the evening, whatever it was, whatever hands completed it, in whatever corner of whatever farmhouse across this valley is finished. And the particular quality of silence that follows the end of work has settled into the rooms. Not empty silence, full silence. The kind that arrives when busyness steps aside and something older moves in to take its place. Someone adds a piece of wood to the fire. The flames shift and resettle. A child moves closer to the warmth without being told to, and in the gentle orange light that fills the centre of the room, while the edges retreat into comfortable dark, someone begins to speak. Not about anything in particular, not about tomorrow's work or the weather or the price of grain at the market below the valley. Something else, something that begins, and you will recognize this opening, even if you have never heard it in this language, because it is one of the oldest openings in the human repertoire, with a gesture toward a time that is not now, a place that is not quite here, a world that runs parallel to this one following its own rules, peopled by figures who are like us but not entirely us, once long ago in a valley not so different from this one. Let me take you to a specific room in a specific tradition because I think it earns its detail. In the German-speaking Alps, in the Austrian regions of Tyrol and Styria, in the Bavarian foothills, in the rural communities of the Black Forest and the Swabian Highlands, there was a winter institution that had no formal name for most of its existence, and that appeared in written records only rarely, usually in the complaints of Protestant clergy, who disapproved of it for reasons that will become clear in a moment. It was called the Spinnstube, the spinning room. The concept was simple. In the long winter evenings when the cold made working outdoors impossible, and the domestic work of the individual household was not enough to justify keeping a large fire burning in multiple rooms, the women and girls of several neighbouring households would gather together in a single room, usually the largest and warmest available, bringing their spinning equipment, their mending, their knitting, their sewing. The work would proceed collectively in a warm communal space which was more economical in fuel and more pleasant in company than 6 women sitting alone in 6 cold rooms. So far this sounds entirely practical. And it was entirely practical. But the Spinnstube was not simply a fuel-saving arrangement. It was by consistent testimony across several centuries of written records the most important social institution in many of these rural communities, and the reason for that was what happened alongside the spinning. The men and older boys came too after their own evening tasks were done. Neighbours who did not have women in their household attending would drift in anyway, ostensibly to help with something actually, because this was where the life of the community was happening. Musicians sometimes brought instruments, a fiddle, a simple wind instrument, something that could be played in a warm room without disturbing the sleepers in the next room. Games were played, riddles were exchanged, and stories were told, not read aloud from a book, not recited from a written text, told from memory in the voice of whoever happened to carry them in their head, and in these communities almost everyone carried some of them. The stories that circulated in the Spinnstube are the stories that scholars of folklore now recognize as belonging to the great oral tradition of Central Europe. Stories about youngest sons who succeeded where their older brothers failed. Stories about young women trapped in impossible situations who escape through cleverness or magical assistance. Stories about animals that spoke and gave advice about forests that were dangerous and enchanted, about the thin membrane between the ordinary world and something else, something older and stranger that pressed against the edges of daily life, particularly closely in winter, when the darkness was long and the mountains were very present and very close. And here is where I want to pause and tell you something about these stories that I think gets lost in the way we encounter them today. Jacob Grimm and Wilhelm Grimm, the brothers, Grimm as they became known, began their systematic collection of German folk stories in the first decade of the 1800s, with the first volume of their collected stories published in the year 1812. They are often described as having travelled the German countryside collecting stories directly from peasants and rural storytellers. And this is partly true, but only partly, and the part that is not quite true is interesting. A significant number of the informants who provided the brothers Grimm with their most important stories were not rural peasants at all. They were educated middle-class women, many of them from families with French Huguenot ancestry, who had settled in the Hesse region of Germany generations earlier. Dorothea Wiemann, who contributed a particularly large number of stories to the Grimm collection, was the wife of a tailor and the daughter of an innkeeper, a woman who had spent her life in the kind of position where stories passed through constantly from travellers, from country people, coming to market from the accumulated oral tradition of multiple communities flowing together. But, and this is the crucial point, the stories she told the Grimm brothers were old, unmistakably traceable old. The scholars who analysed the Grimm collection in the 20th century, using techniques of comparative folklore analysis, developed largely by the Finnish folklorist Antti Aarne, and expanded by the American scholar Stith Thompson, found that the core narrative structures in the Grimm tales belong to a tradition of oral storytelling that reached back in some cases well over 1,000 years. A story about a young woman persecuted by a jealous older woman and rescued by unexpected help is not a German story. It is not a European story. It is a human story that appears in recognizable variation in the oral traditions of cultures across the ancient world, suggesting a common ancestry in a storytelling tradition so old that it predates the modern nations, the modern languages, and possibly the modern religions that would later claim these stories as their own. The Spinnstube in the Alps was not creating these stories, it was keeping them alive, passing them from one winter's gathered company to the next, with small variations accumulating the way geological layers accumulate imperceptibly, slowly but definitely over time. What the brothers Grimm collected in the 1800s was not a snapshot of any one moment. It was a sediment, the compressed residue of 1,000 winters of storytelling by lamplight in warm rooms, each telling adding a detail, or losing one, shifting an emphasis, responding to the particular anxieties and hopes of the specific community and the specific era in which it was told. Can I tell you the thing about this that genuinely moves me most? These stories were not entertainment in the way we typically mean that word today. They were not a distraction from life. They were a tool for processing life. The dangerous forest in the story was the actual forest at the edge of the actual village, the forest where children had genuinely been lost, where wolves genuinely moved in winter, where the boundary between the known world and the unknown pressed close enough to be felt. The wicked stepmother was not a narrative cliché. It was a realistic figure in a world where women frequently died in childbirth and men remarried quickly, where the dynamics of blended households under conditions of real scarcity created genuine tensions that children genuinely experienced. The stories named the fears, and naming a fear, giving it a shape, a character, a narrative arc with a resolution, is one of the oldest and most effective things human beings do with the things that frighten them. The psychologist Bruno Bettelheim argued something along these lines in his landmark analysis of fairy tales published in the year 1976, where he proposed that the dark elements of traditional folk stories, the abandonment, the danger, the terrifying figures that populate them served a deep psychological function for children, providing a symbolic vocabulary for processing anxieties that were too large and too real to address directly. The children sitting close to the fire in the Spinnstube, hearing a story about a child left alone in a dark forest, were not being traumatized by irresponsible adults. They were being given a story that said, this fear is real, it has a shape it can be faced, and here is how it ends. That is a profound gift, and it was given freely repeatedly every winter evening for centuries in rooms just like the one we are sitting in now. The tradition had a geographical centre of gravity worth noting. The region of the Harz Mountains in central Germany, the Black Forest, the river valleys of the Rhine and the Main, the pre-Alpine communities of Bavaria and Tyrol, these were the landscape nurseries of the Central European oral tradition. Not because the people there were more imaginative than people elsewhere, but because the terrain created the conditions. The isolation, the long winters, the enclosed valley communities, the seasonal rhythm that alternated between intensive outdoor work and long indoor evenings, this was the environment in which oral storytelling thrived. When roads improved, when newspapers arrived, when the literate culture of the city began to penetrate the mountain communities, the Spinnstube declined. Not suddenly. Gradually through the 19th century, as other forms of entertainment and information became available, as the gathering of multiple households into a single room for warmth became less necessary as individual homes became better heated. By the early 20th century, most of the communities that had practiced this tradition for centuries had quietly stopped. What they left behind was the stories themselves, fixed now in print in the Grimm collection, and in the dozens of regional folklore compilations that followed their example across the 19th century. Sanitized in many cases, the Grimm brothers revised their collection repeatedly through multiple editions, progressively softening or removing the most violent and sexually charged elements of the original oral versions in response to the expectations of their bourgeois readership. What the printed versions preserved was the skeleton. The specific warmth and weight of those particular evenings, the particular voice that told a particular story to a particular child in a particular winter, that is gone. And I think that is worth sitting with for a moment. Not as a reason for sadness exactly, more as a reminder. Every generation holds something that the next generation will not have in quite the same form. The specific texture of a particular kind of evening gathered around a fire in a warm room in a cold valley, with the snow outside and the stories flowing, is part of what these valleys were, and what they gave to the world, even if most of the world never knew where the gift came from. The fire is lower now. The spinning wheels are still. The last story has ended, and the ending was as the best endings always are, both a resolution and an opening. Something answered. Something left gently open the way a good night ends. The room is quieting. The children have already slipped into sleep against each other on the bench by the wall. The adults are making those small preparatory movements, the adjustment of a shawl, the setting down of a cup, that mean the evening is drawing toward its close. One by one, in a few minutes, the lights in this farmhouse and in all the farmhouses across the valley floor will go out, and the valley will be given back to what it was before any of us arrived here tonight, to the dark and the cold and the silence, and something that is so enormous and so quiet that it has no name in any of the languages ever spoken in these mountains. The stars. And the stars have something to tell us too. Something that the people of these valleys read every clear winter night for 10,000 years before anyone thought to write it down. Something that connects everything we have talked about tonight into a single patient slowly turning whole. That is where we're going now, the last part of tonight's journey. And I think you are going to want to be fully awake for it, or perhaps fully asleep. Either way, it will find you. Step outside with me one last time. Leave the warmth of the Spinnstube behind. Leave the dying fire, the sleeping children, the still spinning wheels. Step through the heavy wooden door and out into the night air of the valley. The cold hits you immediately. Not brutally, it is not that kind of night. It is the clean, clarifying cold of a clear alpine winter, the kind that makes the inside of your nose feel sharp and new, the kind that pulls the world into sudden crystalline focus after the soft warmth of the room you just left. Your breath appears in front of you in small white clouds and then disappears and appears again and disappears. Now look up. Go on. Tilt your head all the way back and look. I want to give you a number before I say anything else, because I think the number does something that words alone cannot quite do. The darkness you're standing in right now in this valley in the pre-industrial Alps registers at what modern light pollution researchers call a Bortle scale rating of 1. The Bortle scale runs from 1 to 9. 1 is the darkest sky observable on Earth. 9 is the washed-out star-poor sky above a major city centre, where you can see perhaps a few dozen stars on a good night if you know where to look. In a Bortle 1 sky you can see approximately 4,500 individual stars with the naked eye. You can see the Milky Way not as a faint suggestion, but as a solid textured band of light, a river of stars so dense and so bright that it casts a faint shadow on fresh snow. You can see the Andromeda galaxy with no optical aid whatsoever, a small soft smear of light to the northwest that is, if you stop to think about it, 2.5 million light-years away, and contains approximately 1 trillion stars. 1 trillion. Standing in this valley with nothing between you and that sky, you're looking at 1 trillion stars with your bare eyes. On a Tuesday night. For free. The people who lived in these valleys, every person we have followed through this entire long, slow, beautiful evening, saw this sky every clear night of their lives. Not occasionally, not on camping trips or special occasions. Every night, from childhood until they died. And they did not merely admire it, they read it. The Alpine communities, like farming communities across the pre-industrial world, used the night sky as a practical instrument, a calendar, a clock, a compass, and a weather forecasting system of considerable reliability. The skills involved were not mystical or esoteric. They were agricultural. They were survival skills as practical and as necessary as knowing when the stream would flood or when the first frost would come. Let me give you the specific example of the Pleiades because I find their story in the context of these valleys particularly resonant. The Pleiades, the small tight cluster of stars in the constellation of Taurus, visible to the naked eye as a faint compact grouping that looks to most modern observers who notice it at all. Like a smudged thumbprint on the sky, were one of the most closely watched astronomical features in the entire pre-industrial European farming world. The timing of their heliacal rising meaning the morning in spring when the Pleiades first became visible on the eastern horizon just before dawn, after a period of invisibility during winter, was used across the Alpine arc and the wider Mediterranean world as a reliable indicator of the optimal time for certain critical agricultural activities. The ancient Greek poet Hesiod, writing in the 8th century before the Common Era, gave specific planting instructions keyed directly to the Pleiades. When they rose in spring, it was time to begin the grain harvest. When they set in autumn, it was time to begin ploughing for the winter sowing. These were not poetic metaphors. They were practical guidelines that had been tested and refined over generations of observation, and versions of the same guidelines adapted to the specific elevations and microclimates of the Alpine valleys were still in use among mountain farming communities in the 18th and 19th centuries, 2,500 years after Hesiod wrote them down. These same stars, the same rising, the same instruction. There is something about that continuity that I find almost impossibly beautiful. The idea of a chain of attention human eyes looking at the same cluster of stars for the same practical reason, generation after generation across a span of time so vast that the civilizations at either end of it would be mutually incomprehensible, and yet the act itself, the quiet act of a person stepping outside before dawn and looking east to see whether the Pleiades have returned, is perfectly continuous, unchanged. The same gesture wearing different clothes in a different language in a world that has been remade a dozen times around it. But the stars were not only a calendar, in the mountains they were a compass. The high Alpine passes those critical routes between one valley and the next, between one community and the market town below, between the Italian side of the mountains and the German side, were navigated in winter largely by night, when the snow surface was firmer and easier to walk on than the soft afternoon snow. Traders' messengers and the occasional desperate traveller who had misjudged their timing crossed these passes in the dark, reading direction from the stars the way a sailor reads them at sea. Polaris, the North Star, fixed within about 1 degree of the true celestial North Pole throughout recorded human history, was the primary navigation reference. But experienced Alpine travellers used a constellation of references. The position of Orion in relation to the horizon told you the time of night. The angle of the Milky Way relative to the ridge above you confirmed your compass bearing. The appearance of certain stars near the horizon warned of incoming weather before any cloud was visible. A man who had grown up in a Bortle 1 sky, who had been watching these stars since childhood, who had had them explained to him by his father, the way you might explain a map that man could cross a high Alpine pass in complete darkness and arrive exactly where he intended to arrive. Not because he had supernatural gifts, because he had grown up paying attention. We have largely lost this skill, not because we became less intelligent, but because we made it unnecessary. And I do not say that to make anyone feel bad about the existence of GPS navigation, which I use and am grateful for, and which has saved me from several embarrassing situations involving rental cars and unfamiliar road systems. But I do think there is a genuine loss in the transition from a sky you read to a sky you ignore, and I am not sure we have fully reckoned with what that loss means. The naturalist and writer Robert Macfarlane, in his book on landscape and language, observed that we are in a historical moment where the English language is actively losing its vocabulary for natural phenomena, where words for specific weather conditions, specific landscape features, specific behaviours of light and water and season are falling out of common use, being replaced by more generic terms or by no terms at all, because the experiences those words described are no longer common experiences. You cannot maintain the vocabulary for something you no longer encounter. The people of the Alpine valleys had in their regional dialects extraordinarily precise vocabularies for snow, for different types of snow on different kinds of terrain in different temperatures at different stages of melting and refreezing, not because they were poetic about snow, but because the differences between those types of snow had practical consequences for how you moved across it, how you assessed an avalanche risk, how you planned your day. The words were tools, and tools that no longer needed are eventually put down and forgotten. But here is the thing, and this is the thought. I want to leave you with the one I want you to carry into sleep tonight gently without pressure, just as a small companion idea that might still be there when you wake up. The rhythm that organised these valleys, the slow daily pulse of dawn and work and midday gathering and afternoon labour and evening craft and firelight story and deep sky and sleep, was not a primitive version of something we later improved upon. It was a complete answer to the fundamental question of how human beings can live together in a place in a way that sustains the place and sustains them over time. It was not perfect. I want to be honest about that because I think honesty is more interesting than idealization, and the people we've been spending this evening with would almost certainly prefer honesty. Life in these valleys was physically hard in ways that could be brutal. Illness without adequate medicine, loss without adequate support. Poverty that was not romantic but genuinely grinding. The isolation that gave these communities their particular depth and character was also for some of the people who lived in it, a cage they would have left if they could. These are real things. They belong in the picture. But here is also a real thing, the research of the sociologist Robert Putnam, whose landmark study, Bowling Alone, published in the year 2000, documented with extensive data the collapse of social capital in American communities over the second half of the 20th century, the decline of civic participation, neighborly connection, informal association. The simple fact of people knowing and trusting their neighbors found that the communities with the strongest social capital, the places where people still knew each other and helped each other and felt genuinely embedded in a shared life, had characteristics that were in their social structure closer to the old Alpine Valley community than to the atomized urban or suburban arrangements that had become the dominant model. People who knew their neighbors, people who gathered regularly in shared spaces, people who had roles in a community that extended beyond the individual household, people who were in the deep sense of the word known. What the Alpine valleys had, what all these remote European communities we have been walking through tonight had, in their isolation and their slowness and their particular relationship with the rhythm of the mountain year, was not a deficiency waiting to be corrected. It was a form of social wealth that took centuries to build, and that has proven in its absence to be far harder to replace than anyone anticipated. I think that is worth knowing. I think that is worth lying awake with for a few quiet minutes before you sleep. The valley is fully dark now. The farmhouses are dark one by one. The fountain in the square still runs its sound, just barely reaching us here. Outside the village, a thread of water sound woven through the silence. The cachalophon in the farmhouse where we began this evening, the one that was lit this morning, and has been breathing its slow warmth into the room all day, is at the very end of its heat, now still warm to the touch. If you pressed your hand against its tiles, but cooling gently and steadily toward the morning temperature. The cattle are quiet in the stall below. The bread from last week's baking is wrapped in its cloth. The carved piece on the workbench is covered with a cloth against the dust. The healer's preparations are on the shelf. The cheese is aging in the cave. The mill wheel is still the stream running past it, uninterrupted through the night. The school is empty, the bench cold, the lesson ended. And above all of it, above the farmhouses and the fountain and the cheese cave and the school, and the paths worn into the mountain by 3,000 years of the same footsteps, going in the same direction for the same reasons, the sky is doing what it has always done. Turning, slowly, carrying its 4,500 visible stars in their patient arc from east to west, from rising to setting from the darkness before dawn to the first grey light above the eastern cliff. The Pleiades are there, where they always are, where they will be next year and the year after and for longer into the future than any human civilization has yet managed to exist. The valley breathes, and here, my friend, at the end of this long, slow, beautiful journey, I want to say something directly to you. Thank you, not in the automatic way that gets said at the end of things, genuinely. Because the fact that you have been here for this entire evening, that you chose to spend these hours in the company of a stone farmhouse, and a watermill and a cheese cave, and a woman with bundles of dried herbs and a room full of people spinning thread and telling old stories by firelight, says something about you that I find genuinely moving. It says that some part of you knows or suspects or hopes that slowness is not the enemy of richness, that depth is worth more than speed, that the things which take time to build, whether that is a wheel of cheese or a community's trust or a skill that lives in the hands, are the things that last. The valleys we walk through tonight are still there, Some of them have changed enormously. Some of them, in the most remote corners of the Alps and the Pyrenees and the Carpathians, have changed less than you might expect. There are still people in Grodnatal who carve wood in winter evenings. There are still Almabtrieb festivals in Tyrol every September, with the decorated lead cows coming down the mountain path while the bells fill the valley. There are still cheese caves in Fribourg where the wheels age in the dark for 12 months or more, being turned and brushed by hands that know what they are doing, because the knowledge was passed to them from hands that knew before. The rhythm is slow, but it is still beating. If this evening meant something to you, if you found something here that you needed tonight, whether that was rest or wonder or the particular comfort of knowing that the world has been beautiful and complex and human for a very long time, then please do one thing for me. Leave a comment below and tell me which part of tonight's journey stayed with you. Was it the 2 sleeps and the hour of quiet in between? The Almabtrieb bells rolling down the mountain? The cheese cave and its cooperative economy that was solving Nobel Prize-level problems in the year 1300? The Spinnstube and the stories that are 2,500 years old? Or just the stars, patient and enormous above a valley that is sleeping? I read every single comment, every one, and your answers genuinely shape where we go next. If you are new here and this is the first night you have spent in this particular kind of company, welcome. There are more evenings like this one waiting for you on the channel, and if you have been here before, you already know what I am going to say next, so say it with me. Subscribe if you have not yet. Leave a like if this evening earned it, and share it with someone who needs a slower night than the one they were planning. The next story is already waiting. It is set somewhere very different from tonight's valleys, a different kind of silence, a different kind of deep time, a different set of hands building something extraordinary in a world that most of us will never have seen. I think it is going to be one of the most remarkable evenings we've spent together, but that is for then. Right now is for this. The valley is sleeping, the stars are turning, and somewhere in a farmhouse on the floor of an Alpine valley, in the hour between the first sleep and the second, someone is lying quietly awake in the dark, not anxious, not restless, just present, listening to the sound of the stream, and the slow breathing of the animals below, and the particular deep silence of snow falling outside on a windless night. They're not waiting for anything. They're not missing anything. They're simply completely, entirely here. Sleep well, my friend. I will see you next time.